Fulgrim, the Phoenician, most cultured of the Primarchs, and later the daemon Primarch of Slaanesh. You can't smell me through your screens, but I'm wearing cologne for this one, just to get into the mood of it. First, let us examine the early life of Fulgrim, how it formed his worldview, and how his deeds from that time foreshadow how he would first become great and later become terrible. Fulgrim's early life on Chemos is a story of triumph over adversity, shaped by the extreme challenges of his environment. His upbringing formed the foundation of his worldview, highlighting both the strengths and vulnerabilities that would define his journey as a Primarch. Let's take a look at this time in his early life, before the Emperor met him. As with all Primarchs, this may be the most important time of his life. Chemos was a dying, horribly polluted industrial world, with some remaining natural resources, where survival depended on efficiency and productivity. The society of Chemos was utilitarian, focused entirely on sustaining life by minimizing waste and maximizing output. Creativity and beauty were thus deemed superfluous luxuries. Fulgrim first worked as a miner on Chemos, at the very bottom of the rungs of society. But then he rose to a position of leadership by revolutionizing Chemos' failing systems. He introduced reforms that increased productivity and sustainability, thus ensuring the survival of his people. Despite Chemos' utilitarian ethos, Fulgrim's natural charisma and pursuit of excellence made him a celebrated figure. He did not fundamentally agree with the idea that beauty and artistic pursuits were luxuries that humans could live without. He deemed them essential to experiencing the full flower of human life. Life on Chemos, of course, shaped Fulgrim's worldview, as the homeworld of each Primarch shaped that Primarch. We can see, though, in close contrast, Chemos' grim, expedient existence with Fulgrim's innate sense of beauty and creativity, thus drove Fulgrim's desire to elevate life beyond mere survival. We could imagine a number of other Primarchs doing well on Chemos and improving their systems, Ferrus Manus, Perturabo, but would they have made life on Chemos good? Having saved his world, Fulgrim internalized the belief that excellence could overcome any challenge, a philosophy that became central to his identity just so much as his love of culture. Fulgrim's early successes, achieved generally as a self-made man, fostered an unshakable confidence in his abilities. Now, this pride would later evolve into arrogance, which made him more susceptible to the whispers of chaos and the belief that he himself was beyond reproach. Fulgrim sought to transform Chemos from a utilitarian mining and industrial world into one of prosperity and beauty. His desire to leave a lasting impact to improve the lives of his people was a noble trait, and it also foreshadowed his eventual obsession with creating a perfect legacy, no matter the cost to get there. We see among a number of the traitor Primarchs that they had good intentions, and chaos twisted those intentions into doing terrible things. We'll talk about Magnus much later. Fulgrim's ability to inspire loyalty and admiration in others was evident even as a youth. This is just standard Primarch stuff, you know? His reforms on Chemos demonstrated his strategic brilliance and his capacity to lead others towards a brighter future. Not exactly the same sort of charismatic leadership as Horus, but certainly a cousin to it. Fulgrim's dream of bringing beauty to the existence of an otherwise drab utilitarian world showcases his forward-thinking nature. This drive to create and elevate would later define the Emperor's Children Legion and their ethos. Fulgrim's refusal to accept mediocrity or good enough ensured his success on Chemos, saving his planet from a slow extinction, and later made him a powerful advocate for the ideals of the Great Crusade. He was not the only Primarch to have this drive, Guilliman, for example, but he was the Primarch who had this drive to the greatest extent. We can see, even in his childhood, before meeting the Emperor, the tragedy that would later befall him. Fulgrim's early triumphs convinced him that he could achieve perfection, which blinded him to the dangers of hubris. He had an arrogance, which was born from success, but arrogance nonetheless. His belief in his infallibility left him vulnerable to manipulation, particularly later by Slaanesh of the Chaos Gods. Fulgrim's disdain for Chemos' utilitarian pragmatism hinted at his later rejection of any constraints that he perceived as stifling his creativity. This rejection of limits would lead to his fall, as his quest for perfection became unmoored from morality. Fulgrim's rejection of utilitarian ethos set him apart from several of his contemporaries. But not just that. His unique vision set him apart even on Chemos, where his brilliance and ambition made him difficult for others to challenge or even relate to. This isolation turned into an inability to tolerate dissent, which ultimately alienated him from allies who might have guided him away from disaster. He wanted admirers, yes, that's true, even among his brother Primarchs. He wanted to be the best because he wanted them to like him. It was difficult for him to have a real friend who would be willing to call him out on his bullshit. We can see some great symbolism in Fulgrim's early life before meeting the Emperor. Fulgrim's emergence as a beacon of hope on Chemos symbolizes his potential to uplift humanity through the Great Crusade. It's a city on a hill sort of idea. But the contrast between his own brilliance and the environment he grew up in symbolizes the isolation, which would later lead to his hubris and arrogance. Chemos' transformation under Fulgrim's leadership mirrors his ability to shape the destiny of those around him. It foreshadows both his saving the Emperor's children, his participating in the Great Crusade to save humanity, and his later darker transformation of the Emperor's children, where his drive for perfection leads them into the decadence and corruption of Slaanesh. Fulgrim's early life on Chemos thus establishes the duality of his character, a visionary leader with the capacity for greatness, but also a deeply flawed individual whose pride and ambition leaves him vulnerable to manipulation and corruption. His experiences shaped his belief in the transformative power of excellence, beauty, and culture, at the same time that they laid the groundwork for his fall, when his pursuit of perfection became untethered from reality and morality. Fulgrim's life on Chemos started quite humbly, with him working as a miner doing manual labor. How does this compare with other Primarchs who started from a place of humility? And how does it contrast with Primarchs who started with greater status? What insights can we gain about his character from these observations? The early lives of Primarchs on their respective homeworlds laid the foundation for their worldviews and their leadership styles. Thus, Fulgrim's humble beginnings as a miner on Chemos offer a study in contrast to those Primarchs who began their lives with greater status and privilege, with the differences providing insight into their character. Games Workshop doesn't always figure stuff out all at once. Initially, Fulgrim's early life was poorly described in White Dwarf and stuff, but they eventually got it. His early life involved grueling manual labor in Chemos' mines, instilling in him a first-hand understanding of hardship and perseverance. These early experiences fostered an intense drive to rise above his circumstances, shaping his belief that through sheer excellence and effort, one could transcend even the direst conditions, as well as creating a belief in him that he didn't want anyone else to lead such a bad life. He wanted humanity to be uplifted with art and culture so that they had beauty in their lives. Vulcan's early years as a blacksmith and craftsman among the common people of Nocturne emphasized community, empathy, and resilience. Both Fulgrim and Vulcan were shaped by their labor, but Vulcan's humility was intrinsic to his character and reinforced by the people of his youth, whereas Fulgrim's rise created a hunger for recognition and status. He was like the early settlers in Greenland from Europe, wanting to prove themselves to be cultured Europeans, not the peasants that they were back on the mainland. Corvus Corax, raised among enslaved workers on Lycaeus, later Deliverance, fought to free his people from the oppression of the tyranny that imprisoned them. His humility inspired a focus on liberation and justice, whereas Fulgrim's labor cultivated a vision of individual elevation through individual excellence. The obvious contrast to any of these, the Primarch who had the greatest status and privilege growing up, was Rabute Guilliman. He was raised among the very tippity top of the aristocracy on Macragge. He quickly gained status as a natural leader, but also the way for him was paved very easily with various tutors and the status and power of his father. Guilliman's early recognition as a leader gave him confidence and loyalty, but it lacked the grounding humility that many other Primarchs gained in their youth, such as Fulgrim's manual labor. This difference shows us why Guilliman became more susceptible to pride later, ultimately taking up the mantle of Imperial Regent. The Lion, Lionel Johnson, grew up as a survivalist in the forests of Caliban, isolated from humanity in his earliest years. But then he became very quickly a knight, and then a knight at high rank in a knightly order on Caliban. His isolation initially made him aloof and guarded, and then his leadership made him unable to attune to other people, the way that Fulgrim's common origin made him more charismatic and personable to others. Magnus the Red was raised in a society of scholars on Prospero. He enjoyed intellectual and mystical privilege from the outset. Yes, his early life was bad. He was constantly fighting against horrible Xenos monsters that wanted to lay eggs in his brain. But Magnus's early access to knowledge and tutors gave him an unshakable belief in his intellectual superiority, whereas Fulgrim's humble beginnings as a miner made in him a drive that he had to have self-made excellence. That is, Fulgrim didn't believe himself to be better. He believed that he had made himself better. Fulgrim's labor in the mines instilled an intense work ethic and a desire to transcend the mediocrity in which Chemos had been mired for so long. But unlike Vulcan, who retained humility, Fulgrim's rise made him increasingly disdainful of imperfection, leading to his obsession with achieving perfection at all costs. He didn't just want to be better. He wanted to be the best, and he wanted everyone else to acknowledge him as the best. He had this hunger for external validation, and that, of course, made him vulnerable to the manipulations of chaos. His labor-based origins, and then rising to the top of his society on his own merits, gave him a strong sense of pride in his accomplishments, but also arrogance, which made him difficult for others to relate to and made it difficult for him to accept criticism. Primarchs with greater status generally had their confidence shaped by their privilege, while Fulgrim's confidence was self-made. This distinction made Fulgrim more resilient initially, thus seeing him through the dark years of near extinction of the Emperor's children, but also more susceptible to corruption, as his accomplishments became tied to his sense of self-worth. We can see Fulgrim's humble beginnings on Chemos as a foundation for understanding the complexities of his character. His early life planted the seeds of his eventual arrogance and hubris and hunger for perfection. Primarchs like Guilliman, who had status and privilege their whole life, developed different strengths and weaknesses. It would have been very easy, I feel, for the innate sense of privilege and aristocracy of Guilliman to have transformed into the arrogance and hubris that makes one a target for Slaanesh. Guilliman chose to not do that, and Fulgrim, in certain ways, chose to fall. Now, of course, the most important moment in any Primarch's life is their first meeting with the Emperor. Unlike some of the other Primarchs, whose introductions to the Emperor were marked by tension, resistance, ritualized conflict, or just outright conflict, Fulgrim's meeting was characterized by admiration and mutual recognition of excellence. It was an exchange that revealed deeper truths about their natures and the unfolding tragedy of the Horus Heresy. Fulgrim's meeting with the Emperor occurred after he had already saved Chemos from collapse and begun to consolidate his successes. He organized the remaining population of Chemos, restructured society, improved efficiency, led Chemos into a new era of stability and prosperity, opening up plants that had been down for quite some time, and introducing culture and beauty into the lives of his people. Fulgrim demonstrated remarkable leadership and ingenuity before joining the Imperium. When the Emperor arrived, Fulgrim recognized right away that he wanted to be loyal to the Emperor. He pledged his loyalty without hesitation, seeing in the Emperor the ultimate perfection and embodiment of his own ideals. The Emperor represented perfection and divinity, well, secular divinity, in the eyes of Fulgrim. His arrival on Chemos symbolized a fulfillment of Fulgrim's deepest aspirations, a figure who could guide the universe towards excellence and beauty and allow Fulgrim the opportunity to spread his influence past just his one world towards humanity in general. Fulgrim, meanwhile, embodied what the Emperor liked in himself: self-made achievement and creative potential, a love of beauty, a desire to uplift humanity. But this mutual recognition sowed the seeds of tragedy, as Fulgrim's aspiration to emulate and exceed the Emperor would later lead to his downfall. Fulgrim's life was defined by striving for approval and admiration from those around him. Saving Chemos was a pragmatic act, but also he wanted to earn recognition from the people of Chemos for doing so. The Emperor's immediate acceptance and praise for Fulgrim validated this lifelong desire, cementing Fulgrim's belief in the pursuit of perfection as the ultimate good. But this need for approval would later make Fulgrim susceptible to the whispers of chaos, as they offered an even greater validation of his self-worth. The meeting between Fulgrim and the Emperor was also symbolic of creation. Fulgrim saw the Emperor as the ultimate creator and artist, and as himself as not just a tool to manifest the Emperor's vision, but Fulgrim saw himself as the Emperor's magnum opus, his masterwork. This artistic lens, viewing life as something to be crafted and perfected, shaped Fulgrim's approach to leadership. If you're familiar with a statue of a guy carving himself out of marble, this is a big thing for Fulgrim. But then that vision of perfection was warped by chaos. It turned it into an obsession with excess, changing himself into a form unrecognizable. We can compare his meeting with the Emperor with the first meeting that other Primarchs had. Vulcan's meeting with the Emperor emphasized humility and kinship, with Vulcan continuing to see himself as a servant of humanity, joining the Imperium in order to better serve humanity, while Fulgrim's meeting highlighted his own ambition and individual achievement, reflecting his belief that personal excellence and perfection was the path to more universal, galaxy-wide societal greatness. Now, the first meeting between Horus and the Emperor is tough to say about in canon. It's been done a couple different times in a couple different ways. Like Horus, Fulgrim was deeply moved by the Emperor's charisma and vision. Both were inspired to emulate the Emperor, but their admiration became corrupted into rivalry and rebellion. Lorgar's reverence for the Emperor was rooted in divine faith, whereas Fulgrim's was rooted in secular faith in his vision. They both appreciated the Emperor's achievements, but both forms of admiration led to disillusionment when the Emperor later failed to meet their expectations. It's not necessarily the Emperor's fault that they had those expectations of him, but how he reacted to them and how he engaged with their expectations of him or failed to engage was his fault. Ultimately, the Emperor's interaction with Fulgrim reinforced Fulgrim's ideals without providing the necessary grounding or moderation. Looking back on this meeting, it's obvious that the Emperor was unintentionally stoking Fulgrim's arrogance and sense of destiny. He made him think more highly of himself. Now he was not just a guy who was really muscular and really good looking, who grew up fast and was really smart. Now he was the demigod, son of a living deity, destined to rule the galaxy. What the fuck? Now, of course, this is just one of the central problems of the Emperor, his inability to anticipate or address the emotional vulnerabilities of his sons, because he refused to see them or address them as his sons. He thought of them as tools. Fulgrim's unwavering admiration for the Emperor became another stone in the foundation of his hubris. He believed that he could one day match or surpass the Emperor. So, by viewing the Emperor so highly, he thus viewed himself so highly. His pursuit of perfection became an unchecked obsession, which might have been moderated had the Emperor opened up to Fulgrim about his own flaws and failures. Fulgrim's meeting with the Emperor shows us the dual nature of perfection. It's a double-edged sword. It can inspire greatness, but it can also lead to arrogance and envy if it's not tempered by humility and self-awareness. Fulgrim's meeting with the Emperor was a pivotal moment that validated his early achievements, but also made him feel even more highly about himself, thus setting him on the path to tragedy. We can see there the emerging complexities of his character. His strengths, ambition, creativity, and a drive for excellence and achievement, there we go, were vulnerable to being twisted into weaknesses and vulnerabilities. His meeting serves as a commentary on the dangers of unchecked aspiration and shows us another example of the Emperor's inability to foresee the consequences of his actions. The man was supposedly the greatest precognitive psychic in the galaxy, and he just completely failed again and again. All right, let's talk about Fulgrim's early interstellar leadership. It is defined especially by his meeting his depleted legion and bringing them back from the brink of extinction, just like he did with his planet. Please note, during this discussion, we are specifically talking about Fulgrim, not the Emperor's Children Legion as a whole. Yes, they were granted the right to wear the Aquila after saving the Emperor's life from a vortex weapon strike during an insurrection, an assassination attempt, whatever. Fulgrim wasn't there yet, and that is not the only canon explanation for that. Initially in White Dwarf, they were granted the right to wear the Aquila as an indulgence after Fulgrim named them the Emperor's Children. Whatever, we're not considering it. Anyway, Fulgrim's early interstellar leadership was defined by his remarkable ability to inspire and rebuild, just like on Chemos. His arrival to lead the Emperor's Children came at a critical time for the Legion, teetering on the edge of extinction due in large part to a gene seed catastrophe on Luna that had reduced their numbers to just a few hundred Astartes. Fulgrim's leadership during this period gives us great insight into his character, with methods and values that he sought to instill in his legion. When Fulgrim first encountered his legion, they were a shadow of their intended strength. The Emperor's Children had suffered from a flawed gene seed implantation process, leaving them with dwindling numbers and little hope of recovery. Despite their depleted state, the Legion still retained a sense of pride, which Fulgrim would amplify into their defining characteristic. Fulgrim saw their potential not just as warriors, but as exemplars of the Emperor's vision for humanity. We can see this very similar to how Sanguinius ended up treating the Blood Angels. Fulgrim set about rebuilding the Emperor's Children not merely in numbers, but in spirit. He named them the Emperor's Children, and said that they can only fail the Emperor through imperfection. This is a fucking high bar, but also his own example showed them that, like Chemos, they could be transformed through determination and vision. He was leading by example. Fulgrim, of course, spearheaded a recruitment drive from his home world, much like almost every legion, prioritizing quality and discipline of recruits. He instilled in his new recruits the ideals of perfection and excellence, which became the hallmark of the Emperor's Children. Now, of course, there had only been like a few hundred Terran origin Marines in that legion by the time he got to them. So the standard Terran versus homeworld division wasn't so much a thing in this legion. He had a personal involvement in the training process. This showed us his hands-on leadership style and his belief in leading by example. And in that manner, Fulgrim's charisma and unshakable belief in his legion and their unparalleled excellence he could see bubbling to the surface inspired his Astartes to overcome the legion's earlier failures. He addressed them with speeches that tied their personal success to the grander vision of the Imperium, giving them a renewed sense of purpose. Remember, the first speech he gave them when he met them, he said that they were the Emperor's Children, and they would not fail him because they could only fail him through imperfection. It's a high bar and full confidence that they would meet it. He introduced a focus on art, beauty, refinement, what we might call extracurricular activities to the Legion's culture. It was a means to cultivate pride and a Legion identity. And then this extended to their methods of warfare, emphasizing precision, elegance, perfection of warfare. They didn't want to be good at war. They wanted to be the best. They were aiming to be the elite strike force of the Imperium. They were honestly more similar to the Custodes than to other legions in many ways, just with better teamwork. These rejuvenated Emperor's Children immediately proved themselves in several early campaigns, demonstrating the effectiveness of Fulgrim's leadership and his vision of excellence. Due to their initially small numbers, the Emperor's Children Legion under Fulgrim's leadership initially fought alongside the Luna Wolves as an attached force, vaguely similar to how the Raven Guard had been treated before Corax was found. Fulgrim thus grew a strong relationship with his mentor Horus. He particularly admired Horus, whose own charisma and leadership style influenced Fulgrim's approach. He led his legion to be first the equals of the Luna Wolves in martial skill, then to work to exceed their example and grow into their own style. Depending on canonical source, the Emperor's Children may have continued to receive recruits from Terra while they rebuilt. I can't find definitive evidence to say for sure yes or no. Fulgrim thus grew an appreciation for teamwork and close collaboration. His efforts to establish strong relationships with his brothers and their legions throughout the Great Crusade were part of his broader strategy to secure the Emperor's Children's place as the exemplars of the Great Crusade, and thus to have the glory placed upon them reflect upon himself. The Emperor's Children became known for achieving compliance with minimal collateral damage, overwhelming their enemies with a precision strike and flawless execution. He wanted to show that he was better than the enemy, using his legion's relatively small numbers to win one decisive battle. Their campaigns served as a testament to their pursuit of perfection, embodying the Emperor's ideals, but also showing the Imperium that Fulgrim was never satisfied. He viewed every glory and honor his legion gained as their right and their due, but never enough. Never sufficient. Fulgrim's success in rebuilding the Emperor's Children and elevating them to a position of prominence foreshadowed both his greatest strengths and his eventual downfall. Fulgrim's ability to inspire and rebuild demonstrated his potential for greatness, and his pursuit of excellence drove the Emperor's Children to unparalleled heights of achievement. Martial skill matched or exceeded only by the Custodes, but Fulgrim's belief in perfection, while initially a strength, manifested also as arrogance and an inability to accept imperfection in himself or others. The Emperor's Children's identity became heavily tied to Fulgrim's ideals, making them vulnerable to his eventual corruption. Thus, Fulgrim's early interstellar leadership was defined by his transformative impact on the Emperor's Children, turning a nearly extinct legion into a symbol of the Emperor's vision for humanity. It exemplified his strengths as a leader and his dedication to the ideals of perfection and excellence. The Emperor was recognizing him and his legion's excellent power and martial skill. He had the Emperor's Children as one of the 4 legions that accompanied him to Molech when he reconquered that, though Fulgrim could not have known the importance of Molech at the time. But the seeds of his later flaws, his hubris, his fragility, his over-reliance on appearances, were already present in his approach at that time. These dynamics set the stage for both the triumphs and the tragedies to come. Though never a numerous legion, like the Dark Angels or Ultramarines, the Emperor's Children Legion was especially small when Fulgrim met them, only like a couple hundred Marines, and thus they often served attached to another larger legion, the Luna Wolves. We should probably take a deeper look at how Fulgrim was mentored at that time. We might be able to see some insights into how he was mentored and how those experiences shaped his growth as a leader and a Primarch. This period was crucial for his development as he navigated the challenges of command, learning from his brother and their legion, and trying to rebuild while also not shying away from exposing his legion to combat. The Emperor's legion were initially paired with the Luna Wolves, both for the practical reason of their small numbers and as a way to learn from a more established force. And they were often assigned to fight alongside another larger legion. During the Great Crusade, remember at Molech, the Emperor's children were one of 4 legions conquering that planet, in order for their fighting style to complement that of another different style of command and warfare. These gave Fulgrim exposure and a broader perspective on how to lead effectively. Horus, the first and most favored of the Primarchs, was the influence on Fulgrim. Fulgrim admired Horus's charisma, strategic brilliance, and ability to inspire loyalty. He sought to emulate these traits in his own leadership style. The two formed a deep bond, with Fulgrim seeing Horus as an ideal of charismatic leadership to aspire to, but which later made Fulgrim's fall to chaos more tragic, as his admiration for Horus became a vulnerability, making him more easily swayed. Fulgrim also later had the opportunity to fight alongside the Ultramarines and Guilliman, whose combined arms warfare approach provided a useful counterpoint to Fulgrim's own focus on small unit tactical perfection. While their styles were different, with Guilliman wanting a disciplined, efficient, large force capable of enacting many expeditionary fleets at a time. Enacting is a weird word to choose there. Leading many expeditionary fleets at a time, Fulgrim just needed the one expeditionary fleet, and he needed a small elite force. When he needed numbers, he could just fight alongside some other legion. Fulgrim's eventual close relationship with Ferris may have begun during this period, depending on your exact canonical source. Like when he was technically not leading his own expeditionary fleet yet. Ferris's practical, unyielding nature contrasted with Fulgrim's emphasis on beauty and refinement, but the two found a mutual respect that laid the foundation for their later friendship. It's notable that they found respect for each other at the Forge, a place where you can only ever show achievement through a physical object. You have to have proof of what you have done. But we'll talk more about that later when we talk about Ferris. The Emperor's children, though small, quickly earned a reputation for their precision, their ability to execute complex strategies flawlessly. Fulgrim learned to leverage the strengths of his legion, emphasizing quality over quantity. Their defining trait was that they were a small, elite strike force. When they needed numbers, they had the Imperial Army, or they could ally with another legion in an operation. Working alongside other legions required Fulgrim to navigate inter-legion politics and dynamics, but he had the greatest teacher for that, Horus. His experience being mentored by Horus honed his diplomatic skills, and so he then represented his legion in negotiations and planning sessions and trying to get more from the Great Crusade. More recruits, more Imperial Army battle groups, more naval groups, more allied mechanicum forces. Fulgrim's ability to foster camaraderie with his brothers stemmed in large part from his period of mentorship under Horus, and thus allowed him to work more effectively alongside other legions. He wasn't herring off into the wilderness to fight his own battles like Korax or Jagatai Khan. Rather, Fulgrim was fighting right near the main theaters of war. Despite their small numbers, Fulgrim worked tirelessly to instill pride and unity within his legion. His speeches and personal involvement in campaigns reinforced a sense of purpose, helping the Emperor's children to punch above their weight in battle. The size of the Emperor's Children Legion forced Fulgrim to think creatively about how to maximize their impact. His resourcefulness, combined with the lessons he learned from his brother, contributed to his reputation as an innovative and adaptable leader, able to take on any enemy. While this period of mentorship and collaboration helped Fulgrim to grow as a leader, it also sowed the seeds of his later downfall. Fulgrim's emphasis on perfection, fueled by his admiration for Horus and his envy of Horus and the Emperor, his determination to elevate his legion to be seen as the best, was, even at the start, an unhealthy obsession. His smaller legion size may have contributed to a sense of inadequacy, as may have his not being found first, like Horus was, driving him to overcompensate through displays of excellence and beauty, and doing his best to get noticed. He was startlingly insecure. Fulgrim's focus on symbolic victories and aesthetic refinement began to overshadow practical considerations in some battles. This was a tendency that would later make him susceptible to the corrupting influence of chaos. Now, he was not incapable of focusing on physical effect. He made a great and powerful weapon, which Ferrus Manus called the equal of his own during their forge contest, which we'll get to when we talk about Ferrus Manus. But his ships were full of guilt and perfume, and what's even going on there? This time in his life continued the development of his fatal flaws, as his insecurity and sense of, I won't say inadequacy, but inadequate admiration perhaps, his perfectionism, took on unhealthy dimensions. The early days of the Emperor's Children, particularly after Fulgrim's reunion with his legion, were shaped by their small numbers and the predominance of Chemos origin recruits. Again, there's some canonical possibility that they may have also continued to recruit from Terra, but Chemos dominated. While it's hard to draw an exact picture of internal legion politics due to limited canonical sources, we can infer a few things based on the legion's situation and what we can see from the dynamics of other legions during their formative years. The Chemos origin Marines would have been the dominant force within the legion, both in terms of numbers and influence, due to their, in many cases, having worked under Fulgrim on Chemos and internalized his ethos. Fulgrim's personal history and the history of the Legion were now tied to Chemos. These Marines had a shared cultural identity that Fulgrim could easily relate to, given their common history of overcoming hardship on Chemos. This shared experience made them form a cohesive group with a strong loyalty to Fulgrim as their leader, making it easier for him to maintain control over the Legion. And then as he rebuilt the Legion from near extinction, yes, the Terran origin Marines could have found themselves somewhat sidelined, but they would have also been grateful to Fulgrim for restoring the Legion. We can see that in a couple of canonical sources, wherein these Terran origin Marines from aristocratic backgrounds on Terra, and yes, with different military traditions, viewed Fulgrim as a messianic figure who had already come and saved them. Now, it's true that the difference in cultural backgrounds here would have created some division, but each group, Chemos origin and Terran origin recruits, would have felt the need to prove themselves and adapt to Fulgrim's vision for the Legion. So far as I can tell from canon, Fulgrim's view for the Legion was inclusive, where talent, success, and achievement leveled the playing field. The role of Fulgrim was not a Perturabo-esque administrator to be feared from a distance. Rather, he was one of them, but he just was the best of them. He unified his legion around his personal charm and his personal achievements. His increasing obsession with the idealized form of the legion and its perfection made for difficulties, but his belief that they could achieve made for loyalty. His leadership style was largely based on inspiration and personal charisma, especially since there were so few Marines to start with. You weren't just like one of hundreds of thousands of Ultramarines. No. You were one of a couple of hundred. If you shot an orc, it's possible that Fulgrim saw you shoot that orc. The first generation veterans of the Emperor's Children, those couple of hundred who fought alongside Fulgrim in the earliest days of his unification with the Legion, were key to maintaining cohesion in these early years. They had a lot of recruits quite quickly. These established Marines were the ones who were, more than Fulgrim, the examples to live up to. He was an impossibly high standard. No Marine can reach the heights of their Primarch, but you can definitely reach the example set by the more veteran soldiers. Thus, these couple of hundred Terran origin Marines were intermediaries, helping to bridge the gap between the old and dying and the new and thriving. As the Legion developed, its culture was heavily influenced, maybe even dominated, by that of Chemos, which had already been shaped by Fulgrim. The emphasis on craftsmanship, artistry, the pursuit of perfection, and culture, Fulgrim's obsession with beauty and elegance, created a Legion identity that focused not just on battlefield success, but on personal achievement off the battlefield, refinement, discipline, culture, aesthetics. Fulgrim wanted not soldiers fighting in the muck like the Iron Warriors. He wanted nobility that the rest of the Imperium would look up to. Now, in some canonical sources, the Terran origin Marines of the Emperor's Children had been recruited from the aristocracy of Terra after the Emperor conquered whatever region in order to bind the aristocracy to the ideal of human unification. Over time, as the Legion grew and its numbers swelled with Chemos origin recruits then, the political landscape became more complex. He didn't just have a difference between Terran and Chemos origin recruits, he had a difference between aristocratic and common origin recruits. But Fulgrim's strong leadership and his personal charisma kept the Legion united and focused on their shared ideals. Fulgrim's ability to unify his forces by his personal example for them to live up to and his ideal of individual achievement contributing to the greater goals of the Legion allowed the Legion to avoid any substantial internal strife as he guided them from near extinction into a thriving, living Legion. Fulgrim's emotional needs during his period of early interstellar leadership were shaped by his intense pursuit of perfection, his desire for recognition, and both his need to inspire and, in turn, to be inspired. These emotional needs show us some of his strengths and vulnerabilities as a leader and as a person. Fulgrim was driven by an unwavering pursuit of perfection. He needed consistent recognition from, most importantly, the Emperor, but then to a lesser degree, his brothers and his own Legion for his accomplishments, artistry, and vision. A lack of acknowledgement could foster insecurity and a relentless need to prove himself, which we can also see with Perturabo, which we'll go over later. The early struggles of the Emperor's children, nearly destroyed by genetic flaws, and a whole bunch of sabotage, but whatever. Anyway, it shaped Fulgrim's leadership. He needed a close bond with his legion, as he viewed their successes as a reflection of his own. Their survival and resurgence were essential to his sense of purpose and self-worth. And then he shared with his legion his passion for art and beauty extending beyond war. He needed avenues to express his creativity and to surround himself with beauty, whether through sculpture, painting, or cultural endeavors, as these pursuits balanced his martial responsibilities. He needed a hobby, Fulgrim saw himself as a shining example for others to follow. He desperately needed John Mulaney style for everyone to like him all the time. He needed his peers, his legion, and the general people of the Imperium to admire him and recognize his role as a paragon of human and transhuman potential. Fulgrim was profoundly devoted to the Emperor, seeing him as the ultimate ideal to live up to. He needed a strong connection with the Emperor to feel like he was living up to his expectations and contributing meaningfully to the Great Crusade. Fulgrim thrived in situations where he could refine himself and his legion through challenges. He needed opportunities to prove his superiority and demonstrate his mastery, especially to his brothers. This is why he sought out the Lair campaign. This is why he constantly boasted of his prowess and challenged his brothers to sparring matches. Neglecting Fulgrim's emotional needs could have led to feelings of inadequacy, which were masked by his arrogance. His fixation on perfection was so easy to spiral into obsession, especially if his efforts went unrecognized, or at least less recognized than he felt he deserved. If he had an absence of meaningful connections with his brothers or his legion, that could leave him vulnerable to external influences that promised validation and admiration. How do the deeds of Fulgrim before the campaign against the Lair inform us of his character and the purpose meant for him by the Emperor? We're not going to go too deep into individual battles here. His early accomplishments illustrate his virtues and foreshadow his flaws, but they don't do all that much to actually change his character the way that the Lair campaign does. We're just going to touch on it a little. Fulgrim was renowned for his obsessive pursuit of excellence in all things. His belief that the Emperor's children should embody the Emperor's ideals in their purest form was reflected in how he cultivated his legion. He wanted them to be the best of the best, the elite strike force of the Imperium. This drive for perfection inspired his legion to extraordinary feats, even for transhumans, creating warriors who were not only lethal on the battlefield, but also paragons of artistry off the battlefield. Fulgrim's ideals and his devotion to the Emperor's vision made him a charismatic and inspiring leader, like his mentor, Horus, instilling in his legion a sense of purpose and pride. But his obsession with perfection veered into vanity and hubris, creating an inability to accept imperfection, whether in himself or in his legion, which led to some disdain for the worlds that they brought into compliance for not themselves being perfect. Fulgrim emphasized the beauty and artistry of war, believing that even such a destructive pursuit could serve as an expression of creative brilliance. This focus extended to how he treated the worlds that which were made compliant under his leadership, where the Emperor's children left behind at least some amount of artistically and culturally enriched society. They didn't exactly stick around word bearers style, but they didn't just move on immediately like the Iron Hands. Fulgrim's insistence on artistry was not just an indulgence. He saw beauty as a reflection of the Emperor's perfection and as a tool for becoming the best human that one could be. Now, this emphasis on aesthetics created some vulnerabilities. Besides just encouraging superficial evaluation of success and making an atmosphere where form could take precedence over substance, it also led to some distance with his brothers, who saw him as foppish. Fulgrim's leadership was notable for his instillation of pride and unity in his legion, which had faced near extinction before his arrival. His drive to restore them not just to their former glory, but past it into new heights of achievement, show us his resilience and determination. Fulgrim's personal charisma created an unshakable bond with his legion, cementing their loyalty and willingness to follow his vision of what they were meant to represent. But his need for loyalty and admiration created a susceptibility to manipulation as he became increasingly dependent on external validation to sustain his confidence and purpose. We can compare and contrast here with Jagatai Khan, both of them master swordsmen, but the one constantly boasting about it to everyone and wanting to challenge Jagatai Khan to try to prove himself to himself, and the other keeping fucking quiet about it. So then, when it did come out in battle, it was a surprise, and it was more effective. The Emperor's Children Legion were particularly noted for their skill at bringing worlds into compliance through relatively small-scale, precise battles, their discipline, and their cultural assimilation afterwards. These campaigns sometimes ended with planets being blessed with an adoption of the high standards of artistic and cultural achievement of the Emperor's children. Fulgrim had a gift for diplomacy and rhetoric. When he could sway a world with the example of himself and his legion, they tended to want to then model themselves after the Emperor's children in a way that, say, the world eaters could never have accomplished. These campaigns show us Fulgrim's initial alignment with the Emperor's vision of a unified and a culturally uplifted Imperium. But his worldview blinded him to the harsher realities of governance, thus planting seeds of dissatisfaction within the people who weren't already in the nobility. Now, Fulgrim's greatest early achievement was, of course, saving the Emperor's children from near extinction and transforming them into the Imperium's preeminent elite fighting force, or perhaps just behind the Custodes. This, of course, mirrors his efforts to restore Chemos earlier, showcasing his role as a savior and a restorer of greatness, a messianic figure for them. He saw his work as symbolic of the Emperor's intentions for humanity, the Great Crusade overall, elevating it from its near extinction in the Age of Strife into the light of civilization and enlightenment unified together. Fulgrim's restoration of the Legion underscores his belief in the transformative power of perfection and beauty, but it also made a sense of entitlement and pride that made him vulnerable to corruption. Individual battles from this time period mostly aren't worth going over, but generally they were characterized by the Emperor's children acting as an elite strike force with very precise tactics, and so they were able to achieve swift victories with minimal casualties. They presented themselves, thus, as paragons of the Emperor's ideals. Their methods were compared by observers to art, with each strike calculated for maximum impact, every plan executed flawlessly. This approach reflects Fulgrim's desire to try to live up to the example of the Emperor's perfection, but it made failure, or even perceived failure, an unbearable prospect for him. Now this brings up the question, what was the purpose meant for Fulgrim by the Emperor? I feel that he was built to be nobility. He was meant to be an embodiment of the Emperor's ideals of perfection and achievement, both in war and in culture. His task was to inspire humanity with his example, to rise above mediocrity and expediency and strive for greatness and art. He was meant to demonstrate through his legion what it meant to reach one's full potential. His emphasis on art and culture was a reflection of the Emperor's vision for a unified, enlightened imperium, where humanity did not just survive, but achieved greatness. The problem is that the traits that made him great set the stage for his downfall. His inability to reconcile imperfection or failure with being a good person, his growing vanity, and his susceptibility to flattery and manipulation all emerge from his pursuit of perfection, his emphasis on beauty, and his ability to inspire. He was quite susceptible to the temptations of chaos, preying upon his desires for perfection and validation from external sources in a way that perhaps some of his brothers were less vulnerable. The seeds of his downfall were thus sown long before the Lair campaign. How did the Emperor and the Custodes treat Fulgrim and the Emperor's children? What did they think of them? The Emperor and the Custodes held the Emperor's children in high regard during the Great Crusade. They saw them as an elite legion, uniquely positioned to embody the higher ideals of the Great Crusade. Now, of course, this was nuanced. There were complexities in their relationship. They had both admiration and concern. The Emperor's children bore the singular honor of wearing the Emperor's personal heraldry, the Aquila, the double eagle, on their armor. This distinction was granted as thanks for saving his life in some canon, or as an indulgence of his son in other canon. It was a testament to the Emperor's confidence in their ability to represent his ideals. The Emperor saw Fulgrim as a reflection of his vision for what he hoped humanity would be like: cultured, caring about art, putting a lot of effort into improving himself, the capability for greatness. This trust was evident in the missions they were assigned, right in the heart of the Great Crusade, involving high-profile compliance campaigns where the diplomacy to take a world without bloodshed, or the precision and excellence to fight alongside some of the other legions at the heart of the main theaters of war, needed to be absolutely counted on. The Emperor gave Fulgrim and his legion substantial autonomy, trusting in their discipline and their capabilities to carry out his vision without overt supervision. His charisma and apparent alignment with the Emperor's ideals reinforced this hands-off approach, but it also allowed the seeds of corruption to take root unnoticed. The Emperor's trust was empowering. His limited supervision left the Emperor's children vulnerable to the influence of chaos. Despite his admiration, the Emperor recognized potential risks in Fulgrim's obsessive pursuit of perfection, and then he kind of ignored it. That's the Emperor for you. There is no direct evidence that I can find in canon at all that the Emperor took steps to address Fulgrim's pride or vanity or inability to accept failure. Perhaps he believed that Fulgrim could rise above them, or that his flaws were not yet a threat. Or maybe he saw too much of himself in this son and didn't want to fucking deal with that. Now, the Custodes, meanwhile, we talked earlier about how they were a bit concerned about the Raven Guard being so far from the main theaters of war, so that made them more difficult to observe and keep tabs on. Well, that wasn't a problem with the Emperor's children. They were right there in the thick of it. The emperor's personal guardians, the custodes. They were the closest observers of his vision, respected the emperor's children for their precision and discipline, and didn't really care all that much about the cultural refinement and stuff. But their approach to warfare and civilization building was generally aligned with the custodes' own philosophy, trying to embody the emperor's ideals. They viewed Fulgrim as an example of what the Primarchs should try to live up to. And because they were tasked with protecting the emperor and ensuring the stability of the Imperium, they did try to watch Fulgrim. There were concerns that Fulgrim could start to have cracks in his judgment or be susceptible to external influences. But generally speaking, the custodes seem to have relied on the emperor's children are right there in the main theaters of war. Surely we'll see something going wrong if it starts to go wrong, and this didn't work. They needed closer observation. They needed like an advisor or observer attached to them. If they had noticed the legion's shift towards a dangerous focus on aesthetics over substance, that would have been a great thing to nip in the bud. The custodes were known to speak up, to try to intervene in certain legions' affairs when they felt the emperor's vision was at risk, notably being present at the word-bearer's reprimand at Monarchia. But there is no such record of an intervention with the emperor's children. His flaws were not as apparent in the Great Crusade as, for example, the World Eaters, wherein partially the influence of the custodes convinced the emperor to send the space wolves to try to punish them. Now, in retrospect, the emperor and the custodes viewed Fulgrim and the emperor's children as the Great Crusade's shining examples, and entrusted them with some of the most important tasks of the crusade. But their relationship was marked with a certain amount of trust, maybe idealism, which in retrospect blinded them to the risks inherent in Fulgrim's character. Had they taken a slightly more hands-on approach, Fulgrim's trajectory could have been altered. He, I feel, needed the least change from any of the traitor legions to avoid falling to chaos. But instead, their failure to address Fulgrim's growing vanity, obsession with perfection, and desperate need for absolutely everyone to look up to him all the time allowed the seeds of his fall to take root. It's worth pausing every so often to remind ourselves that while every Primarch had unmet emotional needs, those needs only sometimes pointed towards similar actions to address. What the Emperor's children in particular needed to moderate their vanity and hubris was very possibly the opposite of what the Iron Warriors needed to help them feel valued and appreciated. Each Primarch's unmet emotional needs came from their unique origins, personalities, and circumstances, shaping their leadership styles, their interactions with the Emperor, their triumphs, their tragedies. Addressing those needs effectively required tailored solutions which the Emperor was ill-equipped to create or provide. Perhaps they could have helped to meet each other's emotional needs. What Fulgrim needed was validation of his efforts and recognition of his artistic and martial excellence. But he needed to be brought down to earth a little bit. Yes, praise him for his effort, but not necessarily praise him for being perfect or some such. He needed to be humble. Moderating his vanity required humility, teaching them to see the value in persevering after failure or trying despite imperfection, emphasizing their collective over individual brilliance. Pairing them with a more grounded legion could have helped them develop those qualities, and they came darn close in an opportunity. Fulgrim liked Pharismanus. They could have fought together with the Iron Hands more often. They could have spent time with them outside of war. Fucking whatever. The Iron Warriors, they needed appreciation and acknowledgement of their sacrifices and accomplishments and efforts, which were generally thankless. They needed praise for their labor and recognition of their contributions. They would have thrived under a system that celebrated Perturabo's strategic genius and his legion's hard work, rather than treating them as expendable. If they had been able to share in glory with, for example, the Ultramarines, or, heck, the Emperor's Children, maybe that could have eased their bitterness. The World Eaters needed to heal from trauma, and they needed a sense of belonging and purpose that Angron had lost when he no longer had the brotherhood of his gladiators. They needed empathy, psychological support, a path to channel their efforts, and notably Angron's aggression, productively. Maybe long-term exposure to the salamanders may have helped them. Fucking Conrad Kors, fucking nightmare. He needed reassurance of his moral compass and validation of his sense of justice beyond fear and cruelty. And more than that, they needed guidance in how to try to achieve justice rather than falling into sadism. Kors would have benefited from mentorship by a Primarch such as Sanguinius, who knew what he was doing. The word bearers needed to feel spiritually fulfilled, and they needed their faith to be acknowledged. They were worshipers. They were faithful. All they needed was worship. All they needed was faith. They needed to channel their religious fervor into constructive efforts, and they needed their religious fervor to be shaped in such a way that it could coexist with the secular Imperium. He may have found balance with a more secular view of the imperial truth, but we'll get to him later. We're going to have to go deep. He's a long video. The Emperor's approach to the Primarchs was, generally speaking, generalized. It was just a pragmatic, okay, I can put this meeple there onto this spot to use that ability. He was just focused on their utility for the Great Crusade, not their emotional well-being. His approach failed to recognize that each Primarch required personalized guidance to help meet their unique challenges and best use their strengths. In many cases, a custodian, advisor, or observer could have helped with this. Fulgrim might have thrived with a custodian advisor who challenged his pursuit of perfection and emphasized resilience in the face of failure. Perturabo might have stayed loyal with a role that highlighted his strategic brilliance and celebrated his victories. Perhaps having a custodian there to help add political weight to his legion may have helped with that. Addressing their needs required empathy and adaptability. The Emperor was not going to display those consistently. I don't know whether it's because he was unwilling or unable, and we'll get to that another time, but perhaps their brothers could have met each other's needs. Now, we've looked a bit already at some reasons for the fall of the Emperor's Children, and we've so far studiously avoided examining the inciting event, the Lair campaign. Okay, look, before we get into that, let's take a last look at potential sources of loyalty and strength which may have been able to push Fulgrim towards remaining loyal during the Horus Heresy if he had avoided tripping over the corrupting event at the Lair homeworld. Fulgrim had a vision of perfection as a tool for the Imperium. Fulgrim and his legion were deeply motivated by their quest for perfection. If this pursuit had been directed towards improving the Imperium and their service to humanity, rather than self-indulgence and personal glory. It could have been a great source of loyalty. If they'd been able to channel their artistic brilliance into helping to rebuild compliant worlds, or if their cultural diplomacy to bring worlds into the Imperium had been more celebrated, perhaps that might have grounded them in the Emperor's ideals. He was so close. He was so close. He may even have stayed loyal just if he'd had another influence beyond just Horus as his main mentor. Maybe Guilliman or Vulcan having an influence on him, or Ferrus Manus making more of an effort to help him be humble and grounded. Fucking whatever. Fulgrim's admiration for the Emperor was a cornerstone of his early loyalty. He viewed the Emperor as the ultimate embodiment of perfection, a figure to emulate. If this admiration had been nurtured, it might have kept Fulgrim firmly aligned with the Imperial cause. He didn't necessarily need more time with the Emperor. He needed a stronger personal connection with the Emperor to reaffirm Fulgrim's belief in his purpose. I'm thinking maybe a title. So Dorn was the Emperor's Praetorian. If Fulgrim had been named the Emperor's champion, emphasizing his appreciation for Fulgrim's talents and achievements, maybe it could have created a lasting bond. Now, this depends on canon. In some canon, the Emperor's children continue to get Terran origin recruits, even after he starts to get recruits from Chemos. The Terran-born Emperor's children carried a strong sense of duty to the Imperium separate from their duty to Fulgrim. They could have served as a moderating influence on both Fulgrim and on the Chemos origin recruits. A cohesive and loyal sect of officers rooted in Terran ideals could have provided stability during the chaotic early days of the Horus Heresy. If he had made an effort to, depending on canon, he did make an effort to promote based off of merit rather than favor. That may have been a help. Now, as a smaller legion, the Emperor's children often fought alongside larger legions. They were the elite strike force, not the source of numbers. Positive relationships with other Primarchs and their legions could have reinforced loyalty and created avenues for mentorship and collaboration. If those legions had not been the Sons of Horus, he needed close ties with legions who ultimately were loyalist. That might have strengthened Fulgrim's connections to the Imperium. And he came so close with Ferrus Manus and the Iron Hands. Assignments of joint operations with the Iron Hands could have counteracted Fulgrim's growing self-obsession. But the fucking lair... Whatever, we'll get to it. The Emperor's children excelled in cultural and artistic endeavors, setting an example for how to elevate humanity through beauty and culture. Focusing on these pursuits outside of war, within the framework of the Imperium, could have helped the Legion to find a higher purpose within the Imperium. Their artistry could have been a unifying force, fostering loyalty through shared creative achievement and a shared cultural base with, for example, Imperial army regiments drawn from worlds which the Emperor children had brought into compliance. If the Imperium had thus recognized and celebrated their contributions beyond martial achievements, that might have strengthened their dedication to the Imperium. Now, these sources of strength were in many cases already present. He was so close to remaining loyal. They were undermined by systemic issues, but not fatally. Yeah, the lack of personal attention from the Emperor in large part left Fulgrim to his own devices, exacerbating his pride and isolation. And yeah, Fulgrim's tendency to overshadow his subordinates in the Emperor's children leadership meant that there was little internal resistance to his growing hubris. And yes, his close collaboration with Horus, his former mentor, helped to plant the seeds of pride which would blossom into the flower of treason. But that was already being countered by the grounding influence of Ferrus Manus. All right, we've put it off as long as we can. The Lair Campaign. The Lair Campaign, both in Fulgrim's decisions and the Emperor's Children's performance, is the critical turning point for their legion. It shows us so much about the character of Fulgrim and the Emperor's Children. It shows us their strengths, their flaws, the seeds of their eventual fall, and the inciting event of their fall. Fulgrim's obsession with perfection was the driving force behind his decision to engage the Lair. He needed validation that he was so much better than everybody. The aliens' mastery of their environment, their advanced technology, and heck, even their artistic achievements presented a challenge that Fulgrim could not resist. He needed to burn them down when everyone else said that he could not. The Emperor's Children displayed their unparalleled discipline, precision, and martial excellence. Fulgrim correctly viewed this as their apotheosis. They were becoming the best that they could be. Fulgrim's need to prove himself and his legion at the same time blinded him to the dangers of the campaign, especially the subtle corrupting influence of the Lair's culture. Fulgrim's decision to launch an immediate, all-out assault against the Lair, rather than employing more cautious, long-term strategies, maybe a war of attrition or a siege. This is emblematic of his hubris and his skill. He sought not only a victory, but a victory that would showcase the Emperor's Children as the epitome of the Imperium's ideals. He wanted to win in a way that no one else could. And he did. The Legion's performance in the campaign was exemplary in its execution of strategy and combat prowess, demonstrating why they were considered one of the finest legions. But then, Fulgrim's overconfidence led him to downplay the Lair's corruptive influence. This arrogance led him to believe that he could wield the Lair's artifact, the Lairen Blade, without consequence. The Lair Campaign is the study in 40K in how pride and ambition make individuals vulnerable to external corruption. Fulgrim's fascination with the Lair's achievements as a warrior respected other warriors led him to be fascinated with their artifacts, particularly the Lairen Blade. This revealed a susceptibility to temptation rather than just a desire to achieve and then move on. The Emperor's Children showed similar vulnerabilities. Their exposure to the Lair's hedonistic culture and perhaps psychic emanations began to chip away at their discipline and loyalty as Fulgrim came under the spell. Fulgrim's isolation in this campaign, both self-imposed and circumstantial, played a significant role in his downfall. Fulgrim's growing belief in his own superiority led him to dismiss advice and warnings from his advisors and subordinates and members of the Imperial Army, and it led him to want to take this on by himself rather than with an allied legion. The Emperor's Children's tendency to operate alongside other legions was intentionally subverted here by Fulgrim. He wanted to win on their own. The Lair Campaign is great for symbolic foreshadowing of the Emperor's Children's descent into chaos. Fulgrim's acquisition of the Lairen Blade, a Xenos artifact which housed a demonic presence, symbolizes his embrace of corruption in the guise of perfection. and the decadent and hedonistic and martially excellent culture of the lair mirrors the path that the Emperor's children themselves would take in the later service to Slaanesh, succumbing to excess, self-indulgence. The most poignant element is the wasted potential that this represents. Fulgrim's quest for perfection could have made him the greatest hero of the Imperium, but as soon as he touched that blade, it became the avenue through which he and his legion were destroyed. Fulgrim is a tragic figure. He's driven by admiral ideals, but he is undone by his inability to see the line between excellence and hubris. His decisions during the Lair campaign are a microcosm of his character. Brilliant, yet flawed. Ambitious, yet blind to the dangers he faces. By fighting against the dark mirror of the Lair, without having been warned by the Emperor against the existence of chaos, Fulgrim was unknowingly exposed to a Slaaneshi moral hazard, the daemon in the blade. Perhaps a custodes advisor, or the Emperor being more open with some of the Primarchs about the existence and threat of chaos, might have been sufficient to convince Fulgrim to avoid taking the Lairan blade. Perhaps he could have destroyed the last Lair stronghold by orbital bombardment, or carefully had a servitor load the Lairan blade and other surviving artifacts into quarantine and storage. Listen, the Emperor's secrecy about the nature of chaos and the lack of a guiding hand when the Primarchs faced its temptations was perhaps his greatest single mistake. More transparency or external guidance could have changed the outcome. It would have been such a small step, too, for Fulgrim in particular. Fulgrim viewed the galaxy in terms of material perfection. And he was almost right. If he had not touched the blade, he and his legion would have come out of the Lair campaign as the greatest they could be, and he would have been bedrock, absolutely loyal during the heresy. But instead, he didn't realize that entities like the Chaos Gods existed or thrived on the emotions and actions of mortals. The Lair seemed to him like an achievable pinnacle of mastery over their environment, not a demon trap. If the Emperor had warned the Primarchs directly about chaos and its manifestations, including the dangers of daemons and the possibility of corrupted physical artifacts, if he'd emphasized the spiritual and metaphysical threats that came with pursuing perfection in isolation, or if he'd had protocols about handling Xenos artifacts, or engaging with cultures exhibiting signs of corruption, maybe that could have done something. The Custodes were, interestingly, the best positioned to help Fulgrim here. They were more than just bodyguards. They were the Emperor's eyes and ears. They were capable of advising and even reprimanding the Primarchs when necessary. If a custodian had been present during the Lair campaign as an observer or advisor, he would have recognized the corrupting influence of the Lair culture. If he'd seen the Lairan blade, he would have immediately urged Fulgrim to avoid touching it personally. The Custodes' authority, backed by the Emperor's mandate, might have been enough to push for the destruction of the Lair stronghold by orbital bombardment. Or a custodian being present in the final assault could have been sufficient to allow for the immediate quarantine of the blade. They might have reminded Fulgrim of his duty to the Emperor and Imperium over his own acquisition of glory, framing his actions in terms of loyalty. There was no reason for Fulgrim to invade the Lair's final stronghold. He could have destroyed it from orbit, no problem. He just wanted to prove that he could. His desire for perfection made him insistent on a total conquest, personally, rather than impersonal annihilation. A custodian would have been able to persuade him to prioritize safety over spectacle, even if they had indeed invaded the Layer's final temple. He would have said, "Oh, look, Blade, gotta be quarantined." I mean, in general, the Emperor could have implemented a strict policy of securing Xenos artifacts for study or destruction with strict quarantine measures. In this specific case, Fulgrim might have still admired the blade and wanted it, but could have been prevented from touching it, thus potentially averting his possession by the daemon housed within. Fulgrim's isolation from the other Primarchs during this campaign, the lack of checks on his decisions, compounded his vulnerabilities. It shows us the importance of having external voices. Fulgrim might have been more cautious had he talked about his plans with a more pragmatic Primarch, like, for example, Ferrus Manus, or with someone who had a better understanding of spiritual dangers, like Magnus. Then again, maybe not Magnus. We'll get to him later. The Emperor's Children's culture of deference to Fulgrim's vision, meanwhile, meant that there was little internal resistance to his decisions. A custodes present to observe and oversee their efforts might have counterbalanced this dynamic. Now, even with additional safeguards, Fulgrim was a prime target for Slaanesh due to his personality and his goals. They aligned closely. However, he was so loyal, and he had such sources of strength to contribute to his loyalty. If his corruption had been delayed, it would have allowed time to reinforce his loyalist personality traits and bonds with other loyal legions, like the Iron Hands. The absence of the Laren Blade would have spared Fulgrim the direct possession which led directly to his fall. It would have left him vulnerable, yes, but still redeemable. Sanguinius was put into threat of moral corruption at Cygnus, and he chose to be loyal. If Fulgrim had faced a similar circumstance, he may have chosen to be loyal. Instead, he was possessed to have choice stripped from him. This is where the Emperor's secrecy and Fulgrim's hubris intersect in a disastrous manner. There are so many ways to have avoided Fulgrim being possessed, and if that one step had been avoided, he might not have been on the side of Horus during the heresy. The Lair campaign and Fulgrim taking the Laren Blade are steeped in symbolism and narrative parallels. This is great. We have all sorts of additional layer of meaning and storytelling that we can use. Let's have a little look-see, huh? The Laren Blade is the Faustian bargain. It symbolizes temptation, hubris, the danger of pursuing power without ethical boundaries, and a ticking clock on damnation. In taking the blade, Fulgrim mirrors a Faustian figure who makes a deal with forces he doesn't fully understand, trading his moral compass for what seems like ultimate glory and mastery of his defeated foe. The Lair, their species, the Lair's art and architecture, are twisted reflections of Fulgrim's ideals of mortal perfection. They are a cautionary tale about how unbridled ambition can warp even the most noble of aspirations. The campaign demonstrates the seductive nature of chaos, being able to bring the dangers of superficial perfection and performative accomplishment into being corrupt hubris. Fulgrim's refusal to destroy the Lair stronghold by orbital bombardment shows us his hubris. He sees himself as capable of conquering anything directly, and he sees taking the hard path rather than the expedient move as the somehow more glorious option. His taking of the blade as a pride at the end marks a classic moment of tragic downfall, a turning point where his fatal flaw seals his fate. The best comparison inside 40k is the Cygnus campaign of the Blood Angels. Like Fulgrim's encounter with the Lair, the Blood Angels' ambush at Cygnus represents the confrontation of a Primarch and his legion with the corrupting influence of chaos. The key difference lies in the resolution. Sanguinius was not possessed. He was tempted. He was harmed. But he had a choice, and he ultimately chose to resist chaos, showcasing his moral fortitude. Fulgrim, meanwhile, succumbs to chaos, subjected not to a choice, but to the stripping of his agency. The heresy magnified each Primarch's fatal flaw, including the loyal Primarchs, with the Lair campaign acting as Fulgrim's tipping point. We can see this as a comparison with Angron's Butcher's Nails, Lorgar's quest for spiritual truth, or Perturabo's resentment. They're all points of exploitation by chaos. There's a unifying narrative structure of potential weakness being uncured and leading to disaster. Now, outside 40k, the obvious comparison is Isildur and the One Ring from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Like Fulgrim with the Lair and Blade, Isildur's refusal to destroy the One Ring symbolizes hubris and the allure of power. Both artifacts corrupt their bearers, leading to their eventual downfall and tragic end. Where Isildur's failure impacts his lineage and Middle-earth's power dynamics, Fulgrim's failure ultimately unleashes destruction across the galaxy and corrupts his legion, the Emperor's Children. There's Dr. Faustus from Christopher Marlowe, Faustus's quest for knowledge and power. Entering into a metaphorical pact with corrupting forces is very similar to... Anyway, it's fine. We can get into that. Greek tragedy, maybe. Fulgrim embodies a tragic hero, with his hubris acting as a defining flaw. Like Icarus flying too close to the sun, his pursuit of excellence leads to his ruin. Maybe Macbeth from Shakespeare? Fulgrim's descent following taking the blade parallels Macbeth's tragic arc. They're both driven by ambition and seduced by external forces, Lady Macbeth or chaos, respectively, which amplify their flaws. The blade then serves as a symbolic dagger, representing Fulgrim's choice to embrace corruption. Yes, the inciting possession was not his choice. But later he did choose to follow Slaanesh. There's themes of temptation and free will here. Fulgrim's fall is a moral hazard. The Lair campaign, there's this recurring theme in 40k of the Primarchs' lack of preparation for the spiritual and moral challenges they would face, leading them to be harmed by that lack of preparation. Fulgrim's decision to take the Lair and Blade reflects the tension between free will and predestination. It raises questions about whether his fall was avoidable, which I believe it was, or whether it was inevitable, given his personality and given the circumstances made for him by Slaanesh with the Lair. Again, there's Isildur with the One Ring. His refusal to destroy the Lair and Blade emphasizes the universal human struggle with greed and power. Both with Isildur's decision and Fulgrim's decision, it both dooms them personally and has broader implications for the world they live in. It shows us how a single choice can cascade into galaxy-wide consequences. Just as the Valar in The Lord of the Rings allow mortal free will to play out without direct intervention, the Emperor's unwillingness to intervene in the lives of the Primarchs and his insistence on maintaining distance from them contribute to Fulgrim's fall. The difference there is the Emperor was a father, and he should have fucking acted like it. If Fulgrim had been warned by the Emperor about chaos, that would have mirrored Gandalf's role as a guide to both Frodo and Aragorn. Fulgrim's fall thus reflects the Emperor's own flaws as a creator who sought to impose order and perfection without being willing to take on the hard work of being a father. There's Frankenstein vibes in there. He didn't want to address the spiritual and emotional needs of his creations. He wanted to achieve and then be highly thought of by others for making his achievements. Fucking great. The Lair campaign and the taking of the Lair Blade has themes of hubris, temptation, the dangers of unchecked ambition, falling to corruption that one was insufficiently warned about. This parallels figures like Isildur, Icarus. There's a universality of Fulgrim's tragedy. That's why it shows up in so much fiction. And then, of course, we can compare him to other Primarchs and characters within the setting, like Sanguinius, to provide a broader context for understanding his fall. How do the evolving actions of the Emperor's children after the Lair campaign, up until the Istvan III betrayal, inform us of their character? The evolution of the Emperor's children between the Lair campaign and the Istvan III betrayal provide a window into the Legion's descent into corruption, as well as Fulgrim's personal unraveling. Their actions during this time illuminate the core elements of their character: initial nobility and ambition consumed by vanity, hubris, and eventual moral collapse. This period is a tragic progression, where their fatal flaws, magnified by their exposure to chaos, reshape their identity and mission. After the Lair campaign, Fulgrim becomes increasingly obsessed with achieving perfection. While this was once a virtue that urged him on to ever greater heights of excellence and inspired his legion, it mutates into a destructive compulsion. This is symbolized by his increasingly using the Laerin blade rather than Fireblade, the sword gifted to him by Ferrus Manus to bind them in friendship and brotherhood. The Laerin blade continues to corrupt Fulgrim, subtly shifting his thoughts and emotions, the Slaaneshi greater daemon inside whispering to him. While he initially believes he is in control, it increasingly warps his decisions and worldview, and ultimately possesses him. Although the Emperor's Children Legion does not openly embrace chaos during this period, their behavior begins to reflect its influence. The Emperor's Children begin to embody their Primarch's fall, with martial and aesthetic indulgence becoming ends in themselves. Fulgrim's rhetoric grows more grandiose, and his standards for himself and for his legion become impossibly high, driving his warriors to reckless extremes. The Emperor's Children's cultural shift thus marks a descent into self-indulgence, with warriors competing for Fulgrim's favor and falling prey to excess. Fulgrim's descent into excess, of course, mirrors the creeping influence of Slaanesh upon him, as he becomes more indulgent and demanding. The Legion, following his example, lost its moral compass, embracing the pursuit of sensation and self-gratification. Now, of course, the entire reason for the need for a purge of the Legion at Istvan III was that not all of the Marines fell. But whatever. Anyway, there's only really two big events in this time period for Fulgrim. First, the fight against the Diasporex. This was a joint campaign between the Iron Hands and the Emperor's Children, which we'll talk about in more detail when we talk about Ferrus Manus. For now, it suffices to say that Fulgrim is a petulant baby during the big naval battle against the Diasporegs and afterwards. He was more concerned with personal glory than he was with his bond with Ferris, with the glory of his own legion, or even with his own survival. Second, Eldred Ulthuan, Fireseer of the Eldari Ulthwé craftworld, tried to warn Fulgrim about Horus falling to chaos. In response, Fulgrim flips out, virus bombs some Eldar maiden worlds, and confronts Horus directly, warning nobody ahead of time. As a consequence, Horus is able to convince Fulgrim one-on-one to join the side of chaos. If Fulgrim had received the warning from the Eldar and then sent it on to the Emperor saying, "Hey, here's a weird thing that happened, not sure what to make of it," then maybe the Emperor would have taken Magnus's warning more seriously due to convergence of evidence. Oh well. Anyway, the Emperor's Children's actions during this period reflect the classical theme of hubris, leading to downfall. Fulgrim's and the Emperor's Children's obsession with perfection, once a source of greatness, becomes their undoing, as it blinds them to the consequences of their actions. The Legion's descent into the path of Slaanesh here illustrates the theme of virtue corrupted by excellence, their pursuit of beauty, excellence, and glory being twisted into vanity, self-indulgence, and cruelty. Their actions during this period serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the seductive nature of chaos. This was the time in which they transitioned from loyal servants of the Imperium into agents of chaos, their actions during the time revealing the foul fruit born from the tree of their tragic flaws. Let us examine a counterfactual in which the Emperor's Children avoid the direct corruption of the Laeran blade and are placed in close contact with other legions after that campaign. Would the Emperor's Children Legion, never numerous, have been able to survive if they had been fighting on the side of the Loyalists at Istvan V, alongside the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard? Remember, the Emperor's Children, even in their prime, were one of the smaller legions, perhaps second smallest behind the Thousand Sons, depending on the source you believe. Had they fought on the side of the Loyalist Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard against 8 traitor legions, no, sorry, 7, they wouldn't be on that side, their small size would make them vulnerable to such large-scale betrayal. The 7 traitor legions they would have been facing vastly outnumbered the Loyalists during the Drop Site Massacre, and even larger legions in primary canon, like notably the Iron Hands, suffered devastating losses. The traitors would likely have targeted the Emperor's Children early, perceiving them as a smaller threat to take away first due to the smaller numbers. You get rid of the pawn before you get rid of your enemy's pieces. This would be roughly the same as their larger plan in isolating and neutralizing Loyalist forces, just on a smaller scale. Despite their disadvantages, the Emperor's Children could have brought great strengths to the Loyalist side at Istvan V. Known for their martial skill and disciplined approach to warfare, the Emperor's Children would have been the elite shock troops of the Shattered Legions, delivering precision strikes to disrupt traitor attacks against the larger legions. A corruption-free Fulgrim and his legion would have brought their unyielding dedication to the Emperor's ideals, thus inspiring and bolstering the morale of the other 3 legions present. And their presence would have strengthened cooperation between the Loyalist legions. He would have certainly stuck alongside Ferrus Manus, his good friend and overall commander of the Loyalist legions there. Fulgrim would have thus been able to use his charisma to foster unity among the Primarchs, getting Vulcan and Corax on board with Ferrus's plan. And then, of course, Ferrus had been killed by Fulgrim in primary canon. In this counterfactual, the traitor forces would have needed someone else to try to do it, and they would have been facing against Fulgrim. Maybe Angron? The drop site massacre at Istvan V was designed to destroy the Loyalists entirely. The Emperor's Children, a small legion, would likely have suffered catastrophic losses in the face of such overwhelming traitor forces. They may have been reduced to a fragmentary force, like the Raven Guard post-Istvan, but their presence and the Loyalist side would have likely meant lesser casualties for the other Loyalist legions. Now, of course, if Fulgrim had prioritized tactical withdrawal, or if he had been able to figure out the betrayal in time by listening to Eldrad Ulthuan, then maybe he would have helped greater elements of those 4 legions to escape. The small size of the Emperor's Children might even have made them more agile in retreat, allowing them to withdraw more easily, regroup, and continue the fight elsewhere. Without the Laren Blade corrupting Fulgrim, his friendship with Ferrus Manus would almost certainly have remained intact, allowing the two to coordinate more effectively against Horus's forces at Istvan and afterwards, as Ferrus would likely have not died at Istvan, except at the hands of Fulgrim. He would have then needed to rebuild the Emperor's Children, but he brought things back from the brink of extinction before, both at Chemos and when he first met the Emperor's Children. He was great at that. The Emperor's Children would have needed to recruit heavily to replenish their losses, integrating aspirants from likely Terra as well as Chemos, like they had done before, but their martial traditions, emphasis on excellence, and experience at rebuilding would have aided in training new recruits quickly. They may not have been able to join the primary battle zones of the Horus Heresy, as the heresy only lasted 7 years, but their emphasis on perfection and discipline would have made the Emperor's Children a cornerstone of Loyalist forces during the Scouring and in the early days of the Imperium era. Fulgrim, freed from chaos, would have been a tragic but heroic figure, a Primarch who overcame his personal flaws and led his legion in a desperate struggle for survival. This counterfactual would have meant that the Emperor's Children, initially small and vulnerable, endured against overwhelming odds through sheer dedication and unity, symbolizing the resilience of the Emperor's ideals even in the face of betrayal. It works completely well with their symbolic meaning. The thematic, metaphorical elements of Fulgrim and the Emperor's Children work great as Loyalists. They're not Conrad Kors, where it's almost impossible to figure out what they would be like on the Loyalist side. No. They were so close. And that shows us what might have been a chance for the Emperor's Children to embody the ideals they were created to uphold. With some of the traitor Primarchs, notably Kurz and Angron, it's so difficult to figure out a path for them to remain loyal. But with Fulgrim, there is one point, the Laren Blade. If he had never touched it, he almost certainly would have remained loyal. Which leads us into Istvan III. When the Emperor's Children fell to chaos, what were the dividing lines between the portions of the Emperor's Children which fell to chaos and those which remained loyal? When they fell to chaos, what were the dividing lines between the portions of the Emperor's Children which fell to chaos and those which remained loyal up until being killed at the Battle of Istvan III? What were the later actions of the Emperor's Children throughout the Horus Heresy? The Emperor's Children, like the other traitor legions, were fractured during their fall to chaos. While the division was stark, it can be understood by examining the ideological, psychological, and sometimes logistical factors that influence the loyalty or treachery of individual Astartes within the Legion. Those who had been most influenced by Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection and beauty, and who saw the promises of chaos as a way to achieve those ideals, were thus more likely to fall. The allure of Slaanesh, offering a path to ultimate sensation and the excess of martial excellence, was particularly compelling to those already predisposed to vanity and ambition. Veterans of the Great Crusade who had fought alongside Fulgrim and who had seen the Laren Blade's influence at work, I believe were more susceptible to corruption, whereas newer recruits who had not been exposed to Fulgrim's growing obsession for as much time were more likely, strangely, to remain loyal to the Emperor's ideals. Terran-born Marines, who retained a more grounded sense of loyalty to the Emperor, were in general more likely to resist corruption among all of the legions at Istvan III, whereas Marines recruited at, for example, Chemos, shaped by Fulgrim's personal ethos, often mirrored their Primarch's descent. Now, this is complicated by how there were so few Marines before Fulgrim took over, but in some canon they continued to receive recruits from Terra. The obsession with art, beauty, and sensory overload that had been permeating the Legion became a litmus test. Those who rejected the shift in favor of the Legion's original ideals were more likely to remain loyal. The loyalist contingent of the Emperor's Children at Istvan III was vital in figuring out that the virus bomb betrayal was going to happen. They fought valiantly during the virus bombing and orbital bombardment that marked the start of the heresy. Loyalists like Captain Saul Tarvitz stood as beacons of resistance, rallying other loyalists from among the Legion's presence. Their stand reflected a refusal to compromise their values, even when abandoned and betrayed by their own Primarchs. Now, of course, most of the loyalist Emperor's Children were killed during the massacre, with very few escaping on the Eisenstein alongside Death Guard Captain Garo. This symbolizes the ultimate loss of hope for the Legion's redemption. After finally succumbing to Slaanesh, the Emperor's Children became agents of excess and destruction, their fall epitomizing the corrupting influence of chaos. There are a couple of key events to look at. First, obviously, the drop site massacre at Istvan V. The Emperor's Children, led by Fulgrim, played a major role in the betrayal of the Loyalists. Their precision strikes, being the elite strike force of the traitors, combined with their newfound sadism to make them terrifying and unexpected opponents. Ultimately, Fulgrim, of course, was responsible for killing Ferrus Manus. Now, there is later the Battle of, I think it's called Idris. There's an interesting battle wherein Fulgrim and Perturabo assault a crone world of the Eldari in the Eye of Terror so that Fulgrim could ascend to daemonhood. Perturabo was used as a tool by Fulgrim in this campaign, showing Fulgrim to be quite manipulative. But then Fulgrim was briefly under the control of Lorgar afterwards via magical means, which shows that he was also quite manipulable as a result. Now, in the Siege of Terra, the Emperor's Children were basically wasted by Abaddon in the Battle of the Saturnine Wall, and so they weren't one of the leading forces during the siege of the Imperial Palace itself after the Battle of the Saturnine Wall. But the Emperor's Children did participate in the assault on Terra. Their role generally focused on spreading terror and chaos, often through acts of horrifying cruelty among the civilian population, as they slaked their foul and perverse demonic thirst. The Emperor's Children waged war against defenseless civilians during the heresy and during the Scouring as they retreated gradually toward the Eye of Terror, marked by grotesque excess. Entire worlds were annihilated or enslaved. Their populations turned into unwilling participants in the Legion's debauched rituals, and or their bodies harvested for the creation of narcotic substances. And then, of course, there's Fabius Bile, who had been playing around with all sorts of weird chemical and surgical and genetic stuff. He was kind of like a Dark Eldar at this time. Anyway, Fulgrim's transformation into a Daemon Prince of Slaanesh, we talked about Lidris earlier, marked a turning point for the Legion. His ascension deepened the Legion's corruption as they became increasingly devoted to Slaanesh's ideals of indulgence and excess, but it also caused him to stagnate. He couldn't change or grow after that point. Fulgrim's withdrawal from direct leadership after the Battle of the Saturnine Wall, meanwhile, left many war bands of the Emperor's children leaderless or divided, accelerating their fragmentation. By the latter stages of the heresy, the Emperor's children were not a combined force. Yes, it's true that they didn't complete the process of fragmenting until the Battle of Scalathrax against the World Eaters, wherein the World Eaters also fragmented into warbands. But many of the Legion had already started to splinter into smaller warbands, each pursuing their own hedonistic agenda. Now, it's possible in canon that some individuals who resisted corruption and then escaped Istvan III may have survived the heresy, living as Black Shields, aligning with loyalist forces. The Emperor's Children's fall was one of the most complete and tragic of the traitor legions. From their early ideals of perfection and glory, they then became embodiments of chaos's worst impulses. Their actions during the Horus Heresy thus showcase the legion's transformation, serving as a cautionary tale of how the loftiest of ideals can lead to ruin when unchecked by humility or restraint. We should probably talk a little bit more about the Battle of the Saturnine Wall. The Battle of the Saturnine Wall, of course, in the novel Saturnine, part of the siege of the Imperial Palace, had profound effects on the Emperor's children, encapsulating their transformation from paragons of martial perfection to the debased and disorganized servants of Slaanesh. By the time of this battle, the Legion had fully embraced chaos, Fulgrim was a daemon, and the events at the wall solidified their descent into excess and fragmentation. Abaddon was tricked by Perturabo because they were both little bitches, and as a result, Abaddon deployed the Emperor's children to try to breach the formidable Saturnine Wall, one of the critical defensive positions around the Imperial Palace. They worked alongside a part of the Black Legion, but their methods stood out for their disturbing nature. True to their descent into Slaanesh's influence, the Emperor's children were less focused on achieving tactical goals and more on inflicting terror and suffering. They sought to break the morale of the defenders through acts of grotesque violence and sensory excess. If I remember right from the novel, this was when they started to show the use of sonic weapons. However, the Legion's obsessions had begun to interfere with their operational efficiency. Many of the Emperor's children abandoned discipline due to their pursuing personal pleasures and narcotics, even in the heat of battle. Their actions during the battle solidified the reputation of the Emperor's children as either the most or second most depraved and sadistic of the traitor legions. Their actions shocked even some of their allies, particularly those from the more pragmatic and expedient Iron Warriors and Sons of Horus. Fulgrim's increasing withdrawal into his daemonhood, especially after the attempted assault on the Saturnine Wall eventually failed, left the Legion without cohesive leadership. This lack of direction manifested as warbands splintering off and pursuing individual agendas rather than unified action. And thus, the battle highlighted the Legion's growing inability to function as a disciplined force. While their sensory enhancements made them terrifying in close combat, their lack of coordination made them unreliable in larger operations. Now, what were the consequences for the Emperor's Children Legion following their defeat at the Saturnine Wall? Well, the Emperor's children suffered heavy casualties during the conflict, where their reckless pursuit of a stupid plan of Abaddon's left them vulnerable to loyalist counterattacks. And after the siege of Terra, the Emperor's children's fragmentation accelerated. They were no longer really a cohesive legion. Yeah, there was still one main part that didn't really fragment completely until the Battle of Scalathrax, but The battle at the Saturnine Wall and other battles they had both before and after exacerbated their fracturing into independent war bands, each pursuing their own tiny battles. Once again, their fragmentation did not become complete until the later Battle of Scalathrax, like with World Eaters, but it had already been well underway on Terra, again like the World Eaters. The Siege of Terra's psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. Survivors from the Loyalist side carried tales of the Emperor's children's depravity, cementing their reputation as the most, or maybe second most, horrifying of the traitor legions. Now, the symbolism of the battle for the Emperor's children was a bit more nuanced. The battle symbolized the final death of the ideals of perfection and martial excellence that had once defined the Emperor's children. In their failure, their actions were a grotesque parody of their original purpose, showing how far they had fallen. And the disorganized, self-indulgent behavior of the Legion at the battle foreshadowed their post-heresy fate. The Legion's war bands were going to act as agents of chaos and destruction, driven by their insatiable appetites rather than by any coherent purpose. Ultimately, the Battle of the Saturnine Wall was a microcosm of the Emperor's children's tragic downfall. Their transformation into servants or slaves of Slaanesh was complete, their actions during that battle showcasing the depths of their corruption, telling the reader just how close they were to being Drukhari. The event marked their decline as a fighting force and also cemented their role among the worst of the traitor legions. The Emperor's children broke apart into war bands following the Battle of the Saturnine Wall, and then after the Battle of Scalathrax. The World Eaters broke into war bands, starting at the Siege of Terra and then completing at the Battle of Scalathrax. The Night Lords broke into war bands in the lead-up to Curz's assassination. The Sons of Horus after the death of Horus, the Iron Warriors during the Iron Cage stalemate. The Word-Bearers are sometimes able to act as a cohesive legion. The cohesion of the Alpha Legion may be unknowable. We'll look at the Death Guard in Thousand Suns later. Chaos has a tendency to fall apart as part of its nature. The fracturing of Chaos Legions into war bands, the Emperor's Legion specifically, is a thematic reflection of their Primarch's character and descent into chaos. Fulgrim's journey from his position as a leader and inspiring figure into being a self-obsessed hedonist, obsessed with the most debased acts, mirrors the broader trajectory of chaos as a whole. Fulgrim's initial ideal of perfection and excellence required unity and discipline. As he descended into the worship of Slaanesh, his focus shifted to personal gratification, abandoning the collective goals of the Legion. This parallels the way that chaos corrupts and splinters formerly unified forces, as individuals pursue their own desires and ambitions. Fulgrim's corruption by the daemon in the Laren Blade introduced a selfishness and hedonism which spread throughout the Legion. The Emperor's children thus became a reflection of his character, once driven by noble aspirations, now consumed by individual excess. The fracturing of the Legion after the Saturnine Wall mirrors Fulgrim's inability to maintain internal balance and unity within himself. Chaos, of course, inherently embodies disorder and entropy, unraveling structure and cohesion. Fulgrim, who once sought order through the pursuit of perfection, ultimately succumbed to the entropic nature of chaos. His inability to reconcile his ideal of perfection with the corrupting influence of Slaanesh led to both his personal downfall and the Legion's fragmentation. Fulgrim's character thus contrasts with leaders notably like Lorgar, who maintained cohesion within the word-bearers through shared religious zeal. Even Perturabo held the Iron Warriors together through brutal expediency up until the Iron Cage stalemate. But Fulgrim's individual pursuit of hedonistic excess left no unifying principle for the Emperor's children. There was no substance upon which to build, no foundation. Now, the sons of Horus and Night Lords mostly fractured due to the death of their Primarch, though the Night Lords had already begun to fracture before then. But the Emperor's children fell apart largely because of Fulgrim's personal living example. His obsession with self-gratification over shared purpose was the cause and also a symptom of the Legion's disintegration. Fulgrim's transformation into a daemon Primarch represents the ultimate fracturing of his identity. His mortal ambitions, moral struggles, and sense of purpose were subsumed by daemonhood, leaving only a monstrous embodiment of Slaanesh's excess. This internal fragmentation mirrors the external splintering of the Emperor's children. The Laren Blade, which initially corrupted Fulgrim, can thus be seen as a metaphor for chaos itself, seductive and powerful, but ultimately corrosive to unity and purpose. Fulgrim's inability to resist its influence reflect the broader theme of chaos as a force that thrives on division. Fulgrim's story thus reinforces the idea that chaos, while seductive, leads to inevitable collapse. His pursuit of perfection was twisted into a parody, and his legion, which once embodied unity and excellence, devolved into fragmented warbands. Fulgrim's tragedy thus lies in his unfulfilled potential. He had the charisma and vision to inspire greatness, but his flaws, pride, vanity, susceptibility to corruption, prevented him from achieving his goals. This theme resonates throughout the narratives of the Chaos Primarchs, where greatness is undermined by fatal flaws. Similarly, the theme is flipped in the narratives of many of the Loyalist Primarchs, where fatal flaws are overcome by one's choices, leading one to greater heights of greatness, notably Sanguinius. The fracturing of the Emperor's children into warbands is thus tied to Fulgrim's character and his personal journey, a Primarch who embodied Chaos's promise of power and its ultimate cost. Fulgrim's descent into self-destruction serves as a microcosm of Chaos itself, seductive, powerful, but inherently divisive. Thematically, Fulgrim's story shows us that Chaos's nature is antithetical to unity, both within an individual and in groups. The material world slaying of Fulgrim by Jagatai Khan during their duel on Terra at the siege was a pivotal moment for both characters. But I question, did it free any part of Fulgrim's soul from the daemon that had been possessing him earlier? Did it lessen his corruption at all? I think that's ambiguous in the text, though there are thematic and narrative elements worth exploring. When Fulgrim ascended to daemonhood, his soul was fundamentally altered, becoming an extension of Slaanesh's will. He gained a demonic name, for example, which is how Lorgar was briefly able to control him. While his personality and memories remained, his essence was irrevocably tied to chaos. This made the idea of freeing any part of him complex. What remained of Fulgrim's original self may be so buried beneath the daemon that it cannot be separated. Some lore suggests that daemon Primarchs retain a semblance of their original identity, allowing for moments of doubt or clarity. Fulgrim's earlier struggles with the Laren blade indicate that he was capable of inner conflict, and suggesting that a part of his original soul might still linger within the daemon-possessed body. Remember when there was, like, a portrait that he was trapped in for a little while? Yeah, there's some of that in there. Fulgrim's guilt over slaying Ferrus Manus before he ascended to daemonhood, and his early resistance to the Laren blade demonstrate that he was not wholly consumed by chaos from the outset, and thus, if any vestige of his pre-corruption self remained by the time that Jagatai Khan faced him, it might have been momentarily affected by the trauma of being bested and slain by his brother, who embodied an unyielding moral resolve. The moment of death for a daemon Primarch on the material plane is one of weakness and vulnerability. We can see that in the First War for Armageddon, when Angron is banished by the Grey Knights. If Fulgrim had retained even a sliver of his original identity, the pain of defeat and banishment of his physical form might have momentarily brought that part of his original identity to the surface. This could serve as a fleeting acknowledgement of his fall, or an opportunity for narrative closure. Now, of course, then there's the symbolism of the duel. Jagatai Khan representing mortal determination, freedom, and loyalty to humanity, in stark contrast to Fulgrim's descent into excess and servitude. The duel is more than a physical confrontation. It symbolizes the struggle between mortal resilience and the corruptive power of chaos. In mythic and literary traditions, defeat in combat often symbolizes purification or redemption, even if temporary. Fulgrim's defeat could thus symbolize the triumph of his original self, if only briefly, over the daemon. Now, the fate of daemon Primarchs is, of course, not true death. After being slain in the material world, Fulgrim's essence could return to the warp, there to reform as a daemon Primarch, stripped of any fleeting humanity he might have experienced during his defeat. Chaos ensures that its slaves remain bound to it, preventing true freedom. Warhammer 40,000 often embraces ambiguity in the narrative, especially concerning the fate of souls. Fulgrim's death at Jagatai's hands thus leaves open the question of whether some small part of him resisted chaos, creating a tragic layer to his character. We can see this come up again when Fabius Bile clones Fulgrim, and there's a question of, well, did Fulgrim's uncorrupted soul then inhabit this clone body? Who the fuck knows? Within Warhammer, we have a parallel in the Battle of Horus and Sanguinius. Horus's moment of hesitation before his death at the hands of the Emperor, as Sanguinius's sacrifice allowed the Emperor to kill him, offers a thematic parallel. If Horus's soul could thus be briefly touched by his brother and his father, it is conceivable that Fulgrim's original self might have stirred during his material death. In mythical parallel, we can find that his fall and possible moment of regret parallel the figure of Gollum in Lord of the Rings, whose brief moments of clarity as Smeagol highlight the overarching tragedy of his corruption. Fulgrim's slaying by Jagatai could represent a symbolic attempt to reclaim his lost brother, even if unsuccessful. It is uncertain, overall, whether Fulgrim's soul was meaningfully affected by his slaying at the hands of Jagatai Khan, but the moment is rich with thematic significance. If any part of Fulgrim's humanity remained, it might have briefly surfaced during his defeat, adding a layer of tragedy to the story. However, as a daemon Primarch, he was ultimately doomed to remain bound to Slaanesh, his fleeting humanity crushed under Chaos's dominion. In canon, the daemon possessing Fulgrim temporarily trapped the soul of the real mortal Fulgrim in a psychic prison represented by a painting. But ultimately then the real Fulgrim tricked the daemon and they swapped places, but daemons are sneaky, so it's always possible the swapping of their circumstances was simply a lie told by the daemon in order to deceive the Emperor's Children Legion. I don't know, man. These two scenarios, Fulgrim either truly reclaiming his body before ultimately achieving daemonhood on his own, or the daemon merely pretending to be Fulgrim, create an interesting ambiguity regarding Jagatai Khan's attempt to free Fulgrim's soul. In the first scenario, in which the real Fulgrim did reclaim his body, but then he did achieve daemonhood. If Fulgrim did indeed outwit the daemon and took control, then that means Jagatai's later plan to free Fulgrim by killing his body would not have worked, because there was nothing left to free. Instead, Jagatai's attempt would have been an honorable but misguided mercy killing, just banishing Fulgrim for a while, but that's it. The Fulgrim that Jagatai fought was a fully willing servant of chaos, not a prisoner. But in the second scenario, that the daemon lied and the real Fulgrim was still trapped, if the daemon only claimed to have been tricked, then Jagatai was right. Fulgrim's soul was still imprisoned somewhere, in which case killing Fulgrim's body may have actually freed his soul, depending on how the warp entrapment works. I don't know, man. That would make Jagatai's attempt tragic, but potentially meaningful. He would have been the only one who saw the truth and tried to act on it. This ambiguity fits Fulgrim's character. Whether he's in control or not, his story is filled with deception. Jagatai is framed as perhaps the only Primarch who still cared about saving or redeeming his fallen brothers. That's what makes his fight with Fulgrim so emotionally charged. But no matter the truth, Jagatai ultimately failed, and there is a being named Fulgrim who is a daemon prince, because chaos wins through his lies. This is one of those great unresolved tragedies of 40k, where we may never know a true canon answer, and we just have to be okay with that. Now, the evidence from Warhammer 40,000's lore overwhelmingly suggests that the daemon Primarchs, once ascended, experience a profound stagnation rather than any genuine growth or change. This stagnation aligns with Chaos's tendency to trap its champions and its slaves in cycles of suffering, obsession, or excess, which mirror their personal flaws or unmet needs, in order to make sure that they can never have their needs met. Now, we'll get to Magnus later. He's a special case, but ultimately, stagnation is the defining feature. Mortarion, despite wielding immense power as a daemon prince of Nurgle, remains fixated on his hatred for what he views as the Imperium's tyranny over humanity. Tyranny which he ironically embodies in his own treatment of mortals in the Eye of Terror. His mistrust of Psykers, despite becoming a Psyker and warp creature himself, his hatred of his loyalist brothers, most notably when Guilliman comes back, and his resentment towards the Emperor. His role as a harbinger of Nurgle's plagues is a grotesque, unchanging parody of his desire to protect his people from suffering as a young Primarch. Angron's rage defines him entirely, and Ascension to Daemonhood just amplified that to cosmic levels. There is no evidence of introspection or growth. He is consumed by anger and bloodlust, eternally enslaved by Khorne's will. Chaos thrives on the idea that its champions are forever trapped in their own flaws and desires. Ascension freezes the Primarchs in their defining emotional states to ensure that they cannot grow, heal, or achieve closure. That's why Lorgar has meditated for like 10,000 years. The daemon Primarchs are not rewarded with freedom or fulfillment, but instead they are locked in eternal servitude to their respective chaos gods, or for Perturabo and Lorgar, Chaos Undivided. Their agency is subsumed entirely. Now, there are occasional signs of subtle shifts, which are mostly better interpreted as variations within their stagnation rather than any real change. Fulgrim's indulgence in perfection and excess reached new heights after his ascension, but there are no real moments of lasting introspection. The limited, fleeting moments there are serve only to deepen his torment or justify his servitude to Slaanesh. He did not, for example, substantially change or grow after Guilliman was killed, or after Guilliman came back. His manipulation of the Emperor's children to embrace their own corruption suggests the kind of strategic cunning, but that's not personal growth. That's just further cementing his role as servant of excess. Now, Magnus does change and grow throughout the 10 millennia following the Horus Heresy. He retains his intelligence and does change his strategies overall. He might actually be changing and growing, which we'll look at later. And if so, he's unique among the daemon Primarchs. But ultimately, his bitterness and pride dominate, and he remains locked in a cycle of blaming others, particularly the Emperor, for his fate. Yes, his goals, such as seeking vengeance or knowledge, and the strategies he uses to try to achieve his goals might evolve, but they are always in service to Tzeentch's greater designs. Lorgar's faith, of course, evolved in its expression, from worshipping the Emperor to embracing Chaos Undivided. He's spent like 10,000 years in meditation after the heresy, though. This shift is merely a deepening of his need for divine approval, not genuine growth. He's literally doing nothing while meditating. He's not out there leading black crusades or anything. Now, the stagnation of all the daemon Primarchs except for Magnus serves narrative purpose. Their cautionary tale, their fates emphasize the destructive nature of chaos, illustrating that its promises are hollow and its champions prisoners of their own weaknesses. The unchanging nature of the daemon Primarchs reinforces the cosmic horror of 40k, where hope and progress can be illusions. And their stasis contrasts with loyalist characters in the Imperium, who, while deeply flawed, do have the potential for growth and change and improvement and redemption. While the daemon Primarchs may show some superficial shifts or refinements in their behavior, these are overshadowed by the overarching stagnation that defined their existence post-ascension. Their lack of true change underscores the core nature of chaos as a force that consumes and traps its champions, ensuring their eternal servitude. Now, onto a different topic. Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection, his artistic sensibilities, and his charisma could have made him a remarkable loyalist contributor to the Imperium's domestic administration and governance, particularly in areas requiring cultural cohesion, public morale, and the promotion of excellence. Yes, his vanity and competitive nature, even long before falling to chaos, might have presented challenges, requiring careful balance to direct his talents towards constructive goals. Fulgrim's appreciation for art, beauty, and culture could have been channeled into fostering unity and pride across the Imperium. He might have led efforts to create cultural institutions and traditions that celebrated humanity's resilience and achievements. He could have commissioned monumental works of art, architecture, and literature to inspire loyalty and morale among the Imperium's citizens. His charisma and oratory skills could have made him an effective figurehead for Imperial propaganda, helping to unify disparate populations under a shared vision of the Emperor's perfection. Fulgrim's focus on aesthetics might have led him to an emphasis on form over substance, risking the creation of superficial symbols rather than meaningful cultural progress. He could have applied himself to a refinement of leadership and governance. Fulgrim's perfectionism, drive for excellence, and high standards, both for himself and others, might have been well applied to the refinement of imperial governance. He could have advocated for professionalism, decorum, and excellence among planetary governors, administrators, members of the High Lords of Terra. He would have been really well at establishing academies or training programs for imperial officials, ensuring that those in power were well educated and capable of fulfilling their duties. His belief in personal improvement could have inspired others to aspire to greatness, elevating the quality of leadership across the Imperium. Fulgrim's disdain for mediocrity might have made him overly critical, alienating those among the aristocracy who did not meet his exacting standards. Mediocrity is, of course, the rule among aristocracy, not the exception. Fulgrim's charisma and ability to inspire could have made him an effective leader in boosting public morale. He might have led campaigns to uplift the spirits of war-weary populations, emphasizing the Imperium's strength and unity. His emphasis on beauty and perfection could have been used to present the Imperium as a beacon of hope and stability in a chaotic galaxy. But his focus on appearance might have risked creating propaganda that glossed over the Imperium's harsher realities, potentially thus fostering resentment among those living in less fortunate circumstances. Fulgrim's passion for artistry and craftsmanship could have extended to technological and industrial advancements. He might have pushed for the creation of high-quality tools, weapons, and infrastructure that balanced functionality with aesthetic beauty. His influence could have encouraged the Adeptus Mechanicus, or I guess back then they were called Mechanicum, to embrace innovation and creativity, though that was antithetical to many of them, thus countering their dogmatic reliance on ancient relics. Fulgrim's perfectionism might have led to inefficiencies or delays, as he might demand overly intricate designs or reject anything he deemed unworthy. He would have been excellent at developing education and the arts. Fulgrim's emphasis on personal growth and self-improvement could have driven him to champion education and the arts across the Imperium. He might have established institutions dedicated to training the next generation of leaders, artists, and scientists, fostering excellence among academia. And his focus on the arts could have preserved and celebrated humanity's creativity, ingenuity, and cultural diversity, countering the Imperium's grim and utilitarian tendencies. His elitism might have limited access to those institutions, favoring those that he considered naturally gifted or deserving. Fulgrim's charm and rhetorical skill made him an effective diplomat. This could have been used within the Imperium, brokering alliances and resolving conflicts between planets or factions within the Imperium. His ability to present a vision of the Imperium's greatness might have inspired loyalty and cooperation among disparate systems. Fulgrim's vanity and occasional arrogance might have led to friction with those who did not share his vision or who resented his condescension. There are some similarities here to Sanguinius, Both of them could inspire through charisma and an appreciation for artistic beauty. But Fulgrim's focus on perfection differed from Sanguinius's views. Like Gilliman, Fulgrim valued structure and improvement, but Fulgrim's emphasis on artistry and aesthetics set him apart. Now, while both Fulgrim and Perturabo shared a love of craftsmanship, Fulgrim's creations sought beauty and inspiration, elegance, whereas Perturabo prioritized functionality and efficiency. Fulgrim's disdain for mediocrity and his vanity might have thus led to elitism, causing resentment among those who did not meet his standards. And his focus on appearances might have led to superficiality, policies prioritizing aesthetics over practicality or fairness. And any attempt to reform the Mechanicum was doomed to conflict. His appreciation for innovation and creativity were heresy to them, clashing with the Mechanicum's rigid orthodoxy. The good news is that a Primarch had just enough political clout to be able to defy them. Fulgrim's contributions to the Imperium's domestic administration and governance would have likely centered on cultural development and education, with a strong emphasis on inspiring excellence and unity through elite elegance. While his perfectionism and vanity would have presented challenges, his talents and vision might have created a more uplifting and aspirational Imperium if properly directed. Of those possibilities, I feel that higher education and elite learning institutions would be a particularly compelling selection for Fulgrim, especially when looking at it in a division of labor sense. That is to say, several of the other roles considered for him may have been served well by other Primarchs, but I am not confident that anyone else could have taken so well to the administration and organization of the Scala Progenium system or other such learning establishments. His passion for excellence, refinement, and personal improvement aligns naturally with the ideals of elite education, and his charisma and vision could have elevated the Imperium's learning systems to new heights. The Scala Progenium system trains law enforcement, the Arbite's Imperial Navy. Later it ends up training ministers from the Adeptus Ministorum and people from the Commissariat, the Sororitas. I'm not sure who all else. Anyway, Fulgrim's emphasis on excellence would have driven him to ensure that the Scala Progenium produced the most capable, disciplined, and refined individuals possible, ready to lead and serve the Imperium. He might have implemented rigorous training programs, emphasizing not just combat and leadership, but also philosophy, art, and science, to produce well-rounded leaders. His influence could have elevated the Scala Progenium from a purely utilitarian system into a network of more prestigious academies, fostering both practical skills but also intellectual growth. We know from the Cyphus Cain novels that athletics were already a part of the Scala Progenium. Fulgrim's love for beauty and culture could have also led to the incorporation of art and music into the curriculum, creating graduates who appreciated the finer things in life and embodied the ideals of the Imperium in spirit as well as action. You know, come to think of it, I think in one of the Gaunt's Ghosts novels, they also mention, ancient literature. Anyway, under Fulgrim's administration, the Scala Progenium might have thus become a symbol of imperial unity and greatness, a network of academies across the galaxy, with its graduates holding positions of influence and inspiring loyalty through their high standards. Fulgrim might have also overseen the creation of specialized institutions for advanced studies, perhaps strategy, diplomacy, engineering, the arts. These academies could thus train future planetary governors and nobility, generals for the imperial army, high-ranking officials, members of the Adeptus Administratum, an imperial academy of arts and sciences could have combined technical innovation with cultural refinement, producing leaders capable of advancing both the Imperium's infrastructure and its cultural identity. Fulgrim's belief in personal improvement could have inspired him to create systems where the most talented individuals had access to the best education and opportunities, and his having risen from being a minor might have allowed him to bring in aspirants regardless of background, not just those from the nobility and aristocracy. Fulgrim's own philosophical leanings might have encouraged him to emphasize the importance of ethics, philosophy, and the humanities in education. This could have led to a generation of leaders who were not only skilled, but also thoughtful and principled in their governance. Now, while this might seem idealistic in the context of the Imperium, he had the political weight of a Primarch. He could have thus potentially been able to create a counterbalance to the more brutal and oppressive tendencies of the post-heresy bureaucracy. Fulgrim could have used education to instill a sense of pride and purpose in both the students and teachers of his learning academies, fostering a belief in the Emperor's vision and the importance for striving for excellence in all things. I guess it's importance of, not importance for, whatever. No other Primarch shared Fulgrim's singular focus on perfection, self-improvement, and cultural refinement. This would make him uniquely suited to transforming the Imperium's education system into a beacon of excellence. Whereas, reforming the Mechanicum could have been done by Vulcan or Ferrus Manus or even Perturabo. Now, Guilliman might focus on pragmatism and efficiency in higher learning, but Fulgrim would have emphasized the cultivation of brilliance and creativity. Sanguinius might have been able to inspire hope and unity, yes, but Fulgrim would inspire ambition and a desire to elevate humanity's potential. Fulgrim's combination of artistry and discipline would allow him to create educational institutions that balanced function with form, producing individuals who were competent but also well-rounded, inspired, and able to inspire others. There are some challenges. Fulgrim's tendency to prioritize the exceptional might lead to an elitism tendency, a system that overlooked the average, potentially creating resentment among those who felt excluded or undervalued. His obsession with aesthetics and perfectionism might have led to a culture where style was sometimes prioritized over substance, potentially undermining the practical effectiveness of his graduates. And the developing institution of the ecclesiarchy might then see a Fulgrim-created set of academies focusing on secular excellence and personal improvement as a threat to its own spiritual authority. The Scala Prodrinium system was, of course, formalized in the era of the Imperium under the control of the ecclesiarchy. They were taught by monks and stuff, not just veterans from their own institutions. We can see, thus, thematic failings of the post-heresy Imperium linked to Fulgrim's absence, notably the Scala Prodrinium. Without Fulgrim's influence, the Scala Prodrinium and other educational systems in the Imperium remained stagnant. They were utilitarian. They produced functionaries and soldiers, but failed to cultivate innovation, artistry or moral growth. Fulgrim's ability to inspire through beauty and culture could have helped to unite the Imperium's diverse worlds. But in his absence, the Imperium's cultural identity thus became fractured and increasingly reliant on oppressive propaganda. Fulgrim's potential to foster innovation and excellence in education could have created leaders capable of addressing the Imperium's systemic flaws. Without him, the Imperium thus became locked in stagnation and dogma. Fulgrim's contributions to the Imperium would have thus been best served on the civilian side of things, focusing on the Imperium's elite educational institutions like the Scala Progenium and other elite academies. He might have fostered successive generations of leaders embodying the ideals of excellence, elegance, artistry, personal achievement, and intellectual growth. His emphasis on refinement and cultural enrichment could thus have offered a counterbalance to the Imperium's brutality, potentially creating pockets of brilliance and progress within its overall grim framework. It is interesting to note, now that we've looked at 6 of the Primarchs, that the Emperor seems to have never attempted to have even one of the Primarchs assigned to primarily domestic duties, instead preferring to have everyone be a battlefield general during the Great Crusade. This, even though certain roles seem to have been best suited for internal affairs rather than military matters. Here's a few possibilities. Lorgar never viewed himself as being primarily a warrior. Perhaps his role as spiritual leader would have been better suited for helping newly conquered worlds, following behind the conquerors. Perhaps he would have been best using his spiritual evangelistic skills to help forge an overarching imperial identity, to get people on board with the imperial truth. Guilliman, though a great warrior, was also a great administrator. Perhaps he was initially meant to help with governance. Perturabo was the master of technology, and may have been meant to help humanity grow past the need for the mysticism of the Mechanicum. Kurz may have been designed on Terra with an eye on his being a firm but fair hand of justice. That one's a little more tough. While the Emperor clearly prioritized conquest during the Great Crusade, assigning specific Primarchs to more administrative, civilian roles might have yielded a more cohesive and stable Imperium. Now, we'll talk about these Primarchs a little later. There's no need to get into it right now. But looking at that possibility, we can see potential reasons for why the Emperor didn't go that direction. Perhaps the Great Crusade faced greater threats than the Imperium had initially anticipated, or at least that the Emperor had initially anticipated. Notably, the Rangdan, or the Orc Horde of Urlak-Urg, thus making the Emperor hesitant to weaken the military front at all. Or perhaps the Emperor had intended for the domestic roles to be run by humans until the Crusade was done, only then to have Primarchs take on domestic leadership roles. Both of these theories are plausible explanations for why the Emperor chose to prioritize the military roles of the Primarchs during the Great Crusade, despite their potential for domestic leadership. Let's take a little deeper dive here. The galaxy during the Great Crusade was far more dangerous than even the Emperor might have anticipated at the outset of the Great Crusade, with devastating enemies who were existential threats to the Imperium. The Rangdan Xenocides were fought against the Rangdan, possibly the Imperium's greatest existential threat during the early and mid-Great Crusade. It was a series of wars so catastrophic that entire legions were nearly annihilated, and the Imperium itself was pushed to its limits. This might have convinced the Emperor that every available Primarch and legion was necessary to confront these galactic-scale threats. Meanwhile, the orc horde of Urlak-Urg, the Greenskins' vast wog over several sectors, required immense military coordination to counter, ultimately culminating in the promotion of Horus to War Master. Maybe the Emperor thus saw a need for immediate military leadership as paramount, deferring domestic concerns until after those existential threats had been neutralized. This urgency of survival might explain why even Primarchs better suited to governance or cultural roles were thrust into military command. But this approach created vulnerabilities in the long term by neglecting integration and ideological unity within the Imperium. The Emperor relied on Astartes as both conquerors and enforcers, and this left a fragile foundation for post-Crusade governance. Remember, after the Emperor died, and the War Master was, of course, a traitor, the High Lords of Terra stepped in more or less out of an idea that there was a power vacuum. The only alternative was for someone like Guilliman to just be a dictator forever, you know? Another possibility is that the Emperor intended for humans to manage domestic affairs until the galaxy was unified, and then have the Primarchs transition to overseeing things. There's limited evidence for this, and there's some evidence against this, such as his having made a series of apartments for them to retire to. The Emperor might have envisioned the Primarchs as a bridge between his vision and the eventual human-led governance of the Imperium. Malcador the Sigillite and other human advisors on the Imperial War Council, later the High Lords of Terra, managed the administrative core of the Imperium during the Great Crusade. This suggests that the Emperor trusted capable humans to handle internal affairs for the time being. The Emperor's sudden focus on the Webway project after the triumph at Ullanor may have indicated that he thought the crusade was nearing completion, allowing for a shift in his priorities. Or perhaps there had been some breakthrough made in the Webway project, which meant suddenly his own personal involvement could be justified. Overall, though, this plan assumes that the Emperor had both the time and the cooperation from his sons to enact such a transition. But the Horus Heresy revealed that the Primarch's discontent had already festered and gone unchecked, leaving little room for domestic roles to take shape. We can see a potential for combined theory here. Perhaps greater threats accelerated the Emperor's plans. Maybe the Emperor originally intended for the Primarchs to transition to domestic roles post-Crusade, but was forced to adapt to the unforeseen scale of galactic threats. This would explain why it seems the Emperor designed certain Primarchs with non-military strengths, expecting them to lead domestically after conquest. But the existential threats of the Rangdan, the Orcs, forced him to delay domestic integration, accelerating the assignment of Primarchs into leadership at the military front as soon as he found them. And then, by the time that the galaxy had been unified, the seeds of rebellion and discontent had already been sown, disrupting any post-Crusade plans. We'll take a look at Lorgar later. I feel that his story particularly supports this second theory. Had the Emperor allowed him to play a secular spiritual role, a way to evangelize the imperial truth, he might have avoided the resentment and eventual betrayal that led to his participation on the side of chaos. Instead, by punishing Lorgar for his faith, the Emperor thus alienated him, demonstrating how a lack of alignment between roles and personalities contributed to the Imperium's downfall. Through the Fisher King lens, Fulgrim, with his obsession with perfection, artistry, and the pursuit of excellence, can be thematically linked to the Adeptus Mechanicus, particularly its focus on technological craftsmanship that has gone unheeded, and the Imperial Navy, with its emphasis on aristocracy within its officer cadre, and on the grandeur of its ships of war. His fall represents the corruption of these ideals into stagnation, decadence, and the prioritization of form over function, mirroring failings in the Imperium's post-heresy institutions. Fulgrim's corruption into excess and narcissism perhaps mirrors the Mechanicus's obsessive reliance on ancient standard template constructs, prioritizing preserving past designs over innovation and adaptability. And just as Fulgrim's drive for perfection became destructive, Mechanicus's fixation on sacred relics prevents technological growth and innovation, leaving the Imperium technologically stagnant and increasingly dependent on deteriorating relics. Fulgrim's pursuit of beauty for its own sake, even at the expense of practicality, perhaps parallels the Imperial Navy's tendency to prioritize symbolism over efficiency. Ships are designed to inspire awe, but this sometimes comes at the cost of practicality and warfare. The Navy's inflexibility and reliance on tradition and aristocracy, much like Fulgrim's descent into decadence, make it slow to adapt to new challenges and threats. We see this when the Tyranids arrive, of course. And then maybe even the Ecclesiarchy might be thematically linked with Fulgrim's fall. Just as Fulgrim's vanity led him to corruption, the Ecclesiarchy's obsession with appearances can prioritize grandeur over genuine faith or morality or care for the people. The Church's focus on spectacle and martyrdom echoes Fulgrim's descent into indulgence, reinforcing the Imperium's oppressive hierarchy rather than uplifting its people. We can see overall that Fulgrim's fall is a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of excellence without restraint or purpose leads to decadence. The Imperium's institutions mirror this flaw, prioritizing spectacle and tradition over practicality and progress. The Adeptus Mechanicus' reliance on ritualized maintenance, and the Navy's focus on an aristocracy officer cadre over adaptability, are examples of perhaps how Fulgrim's obsessions live on in distorted forms. Fulgrim's descent into chaos perhaps echoes the Imperium's broader loss of creativity and innovation after the heresy. His story symbolizes the danger of focusing too much on the past and on appearances, rather than addressing the needs of the present, with especially the Mechanicus' refusal to innovate and the Navy's adherence to outdated doctrines, reflecting the stagnation that Fulgrim's fall represents. Fulgrim's self-worship and eventual transformation into a daemon prince mirror the Imperium's tendency to glorify its institutions and leaders at the expense of its people. The Ecclesiarchy's focus on building grand cathedrals and its reverence for saints over addressing the suffering of the faithful perhaps reflect this thematic failing. Fulgrim's love of beauty and art was corrupted into indulgence by Slaanesh. Similarly, the Imperium's use of art, architecture, and symbolism are bent to the cause of propaganda, serving to oppress and control, rather than inspire or uplift. The construction of immense ornate monuments and the veneration of relics, even while allowing vast and horrible poverty, serve as reminders of the Imperium's inability to move past and move beyond its past glories. In the Fisher King narrative, then, Fulgrim embodies a wound caused by the corruption of idealism into narcissism and excess. His absence leaves the Imperium with institutions that superficially pursue excellence, but lack the soul and purpose needed to truly serve humanity. The Adeptus Mechanicus reflects his lost artistry, mired in ritual and stagnation. The Imperial Navy reflects his grandeur, but his inability to adapt or evolve at the same time. And the Ecclesiarchy reflects his focus on appearances, prioritizing spectacle over substance. But none of these institutions are the primary Fisher King institution associated with Fulgrim. Rather, let us consider the institution of aristocracy in the Imperium. Yes, it can take a number of different forms, but overall they can be said to function similarly. And there is notably a canonical predilection for Slaaneshi cults. For example, in the Cephas Cain novel, Choose Your Enemies by Sandy Mitchell. Oh, I might not have that in this stack. Whatever. The noble houses, planetary governors, and wealthy merchant families are clearly linked to Fulgrim, the institution of aristocracy reflecting his obsession with beauty, refinement, and self-indulgent, and revealing the deeper flaws and corruption that led to his fall. The aristocracy's decadence, predilection for excess, and susceptibility to Slaanesh's influence resonates strongly with Fulgrim's narrative arc, making it the ideal symbolic counterpoint. Viewing the imperial aristocracy as a Fisher King institution, we can see obvious parallels to Fulgrim. The aristocracy often mirrors Fulgrim's pursuit of at least outward perfection, expressed through their ostentatious displays of wealth, power, and beauty. Just as Fulgrim sought to craft himself into a perfect being, the nobility revels in maintaining appearances, crafting their environments and personas to reflect their elevated status. The nobility of the Imperium often falls prey to the same narcissism and excess that consumed Fulgrim. Their lavish lifestyles and disregard for the suffering of the lower classes echo Fulgrim's eventual descent into hedonism and self-worship. The aristocracy's predilection for excess thus makes them prime targets for Slaaneshi cults, much like how Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection made him susceptible to Slaanesh's temptations. Their fascination with beauty, pleasure, and power often lead to moral decay and outright treachery. Interestingly, there's a different canon thing about that. The aristocracy of Istvan III had been corrupted by Slaanesh even before they were originally brought into compliance during the Great Crusade. Anyway, the aristocracy of the Imperium of Warhammer 40,000 frequently prioritizes personal pleasure, wealth, and status over the well-being of the people they govern. Fulgrim's obsession with his own perfection and pleasure reflects the same disregard for responsibility, leading to the destruction of his ideals and his eventual transformation into a daemon prince. The aristocracy's decadence leads them to form Slaaneshi cults, where their pursuit of pleasure and sensation knows no bounds. These cults destabilize the Imperium from within, mirroring Fulgrim's role in spreading chaos through his fall. As seen in the Cephas Cain novel, Choose Your Enemies, noble houses are fertile ground for corruption, aligning themselves with the ruinous powers for power and indulgence, notably Slaanesh, due to their already extant predilection for hedonism. The nobility's self-indulgence comes at the expense of the common people, both in reality and in Warhammer 40,000, who are taxed heavily, exploited, or neglected. In Warhammer 40,000, this reflects Fulgrim's inability to see beyond his own desires, ultimately causing harm to those he once led. The contrast between the suffering of the lower classes and the aristocracy's decadence highlight the moral and ethical void left by Fulgrim's absence as a constructive leader. Like Fulgrim's descent into valuing beauty for its own sake, the aristocracy's focus on maintaining appearances leads to stagnation. Rather than driving progress, they cling to outdated traditions and symbols of power. Their obsession with ostentatious displays of wealth, luxury, pageantry, mirrors Fulgrim's descent into self-glorification, where surface perfection hid inner corruption. Fulgrim's fall represents the danger of unchecked indulgence, a theme echoed in the aristocracy's role within the modern imperium. Their pursuit of wealth and hedonism weakens the moral fabric of society, leaving the imperium more vulnerable to internal rot. Without Fulgrim's potential for self-discipline and purpose, the aristocracy becomes a hollow shell of refinement, focused on shallow pleasures rather than meaningful contributions. Fulgrim's fall to Slaanesh mirrors the aristocracy's susceptibility to chaos cults, especially those of Slaanesh. Their unchecked desires and moral vacuity make them ideal prey for the ruinous powers. And then this corruption can spread to entire worlds, destabilizing the Imperium from within, and creating additional burdens for already overstretched Imperial forces. The nobility's fixation on their own lives mirrors Fulgrim's self-absorption, especially after his fall to chaos. The aristocracy's neglect of the common people leads to rebellions, suffering, and a growing divide between the rulers and the ruled. The lack of compassion and responsibility among the aristocracy leaves the Imperium fragmented and vulnerable, much like Fulgrim's abandonment of his legion and how that left them vulnerable to fragmenting into warbands. Fulgrim's potential to be a brilliant leader in the Loyalist Imperium was squandered by his fall, and the same can be said for the aristocracy of the modern Imperium. Instead of using their influence and power to uplift the Imperium, they squander resources on vanity and indulgence. This results in a class of rulers who maintain power but lack purpose, leaving the Imperium directionless and stagnant in their spheres of influence. In the Fisher King narrative, Fulgrim's fall represents a wound to the soul of the Imperium, reflected in the moral and functional decay of its aristocracy. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, indulgence, and vanity, while his absence as a constructive figure leaves a void where true leadership and refinement could have flourished. The aristocracy, in both reality and 40K, is outwardly grand, but inwardly hollow, riddled with corruption and decay. In Warhammer 40,000, it is the lack of Fulgrim's potential for balance between beauty and purpose which leads the nobility to perpetuate inequality, decadence, and vulnerability to moral corruption. In reality, they have no such excuse. The unexpected friendship between Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus is well described in canon and need not be explored here. I wonder what may have been some other good options for Fulgrim to have friendship with other Primarchs. Perhaps Sanguinius, another idealist. Both Fulgrim and Sanguinius were paragons of both beauty and artistry and charisma, admired by both their legions and the wider Imperium. They shared a deep appreciation for art and culture to uplift humanity. Sanguinius's humility and selflessness might have tempered Fulgrim's vanity, while Fulgrim's drive for perfection might have inspired Sanguinius to reach new heights in his leadership and vision for humanity. Both were willing to sacrifice greatly for their ideals, and this shared sense of purpose might have deepened their bond. Fulgrim's descent into self-obsession, even before Lair, might have clashed with Sanguinius's unshakable sense of duty and his focus on the greater good. But that may have also helped to prevent or moderate Fulgrim's descent. Meanwhile, Fulgrim might have envied Sanguinius's natural grace and the love he inspired in others, potentially breeding a sense of insecurity. Jagatai Khan perhaps may have been a good choice. Jagatai's philosophical nature and appreciation for beauty, expressed through the culture he shared with his legion, might have resonated with Fulgrim's artistic sensibilities. Fulgrim's structured pursuit of personal excellence might have complemented Jagatai's more instinctive and fluid approach, leading to mutual appreciation and inspiration in their respective philosophies. The Khan's disdain for rigid hierarchies and his tendency to distance himself from imperial politics might have frustrated Fulgrim, who valued structure and recognition. Perhaps Rabute Guilliman. Guilliman's pragmatic and disciplined approach to governance might have provided Fulgrim with a stabilizing influence, helping him to channel his pursuit of perfection into constructive goals for the Imperium. Fulgrim's artistic flair might have inspired Guilliman to think beyond pure functionality and consider the cultural and symbolic aspects of his vision for the Imperium. But then again, Guilliman's focus on practicality and efficiency might have clashed with Fulgrim's tendency to prioritize aesthetics, cultural refinement, and personal achievement. Fulgrim might have seen Guilliman's rigid worldview as stifling, just as Guilliman and other Primarchs viewed Fulgrim's vanity as a distraction. But perhaps they might have moderated each other, helping them to each become more whole people. Lorgar is an interesting choice. Both Fulgrim and Lorgar were deeply driven by their ideals, with Fulgrim pursuing perfection and Lorgar speaking more spiritual truth. But they might have bonded over their shared desire to elevate humanity, albeit through different means. Fulgrim's charisma and artistry and Lorgar's oratory skills might have complemented each other in fostering cultural and spiritual growth within the Imperium. Fulgrim's secular and self-focused worldview might have clashed with Lorgar's religious zeal, whereas Lorgar's introspective nature and insecurity might have grated against Fulgrim's outward bravado and confidence. There are, of course, several bad choices. Conrad Kurs. Fulgrim's pursuit of beauty and excellence and interest in uplifting humanity clashed with Kurs's grim focus on fear and what he thought of as justice. They were too ideologically opposed to foster a meaningful connection. Fulgrim's refined discipline and Angron's unbridled rage were polar opposites, making any friendship unlikely. And Mortarian's disdain for luxury might have clashed with Fulgrim's flamboyance, while Fulgrim's vanity and bravado and may have made him a challenging friend. Perhaps there were other Primarchs besides just Ferrus Manus who could have offered opportunities for meaningful relationships, which could have enriched Fulgrim's perspective and provided him with emotional balance. These friendships might have tempered Fulgrim's flaws and strengthened his resolve to pursue perfection with purpose rather than for self-indulgence and self-aggrandizement. The main hypothesis we have found so far in our academic consideration of the Primarch myths is that their faults are a result of unmet emotional needs. This relatability is the reason why their stories are compelling. The point which is gradually developing throughout this work appears to be that the Emperor was not able or willing to meet his sons' emotional needs. He wasn't even willing to call them his sons, but perhaps they could have reached each other as brothers to meet each other's needs. This idea lets us view things in a new light, in which we need to not rage against a divine being for not fixing all of our problems, because what we do, what we have, allows us to help each other. This reframes the mythos of the Primarchs not as a story of inevitable tragedy, but instead as lost potential, unfulfilled connection, and the possibilities of redemption through unity and brotherhood. The Emperor, for all his power and ambition, fundamentally failed to meet the emotional needs of his sons. This failure is not merely about neglect, but represent his belief that his sons were secondary to the grand vision of the Imperium. He viewed them as tools to achieve his goals rather than as people in their own right. This dehumanization, whether intentional or not, is the root of so many of the faults that festered in the Primarchs. The emotional needs of the Primarchs are deeply relatable because they are human. Angron's need for healing from trauma, Fulgrim's desire for recognition and affirmation in the face of his own insecurities, his longing for justice and understanding in the face of a world which seems irredeemable. Each of these unmet needs resonates with the reader because they mirror universal human experiences. Their stories remind us of the consequences of ignoring those needs, both in ourselves and in others. But these stories, the idea that the Primarchs could have met each other's emotional needs, that's deeply hopeful. It suggests that while the Emperor's failures were monumental, they were not insurmountable. In universe, by fostering bonds of brotherhood and mutual understanding, the Primarchs could have healed each other's wounds and balanced each other's excesses and personal flaws. Out of universe, in the real world, we can all do that for each other. We don't need to rely on the divine hand of God to come down and work miracles. We can help each other in universe. Angron's wrath could have been tempered by Vulcan's compassion. Fulgrim's perfectionism might have been grounded by Corax's more human-focused ideals, and Kerr's despair might have been alleviated by Sanguinius's hope. These pairings, these interactions, symbolize the power of human connection to address the gaps left by flawed leadership or broken systems. This interpretation thus shifts the narrative focus of Warhammer 40,000 from the Emperor's failures to the Primarch's potential for growth and interdependence. The stories of the Primarchs are not merely cautionary tales about hubris or ambition. They are allegories for the power of community and mutual care. Yes, the Imperium failed to have good community or mutual care, but we don't have to be the Imperium. As readers, we are drawn to these myths because they reflect our own struggles. The Primarchs' failures are relatable, but they were not inevitable. Their redemption is just as relatable. We can imagine a universe where the Primarchs support each other, and we can then live that universe. We have our own capacity to help each other right now in the absence of perfect divine leadership. The Horus Heresy was a tragedy, not of inevitable doom, but of lost opportunities. It's a story about the dangers of isolation and the transformative power of connection. It's not just a story of war and betrayal, it is also a meditation on humanity's ability to uplift one another through compassion and understanding. For Fulgrim, some additional matters to consider might include Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection and its connection to his emotional state. How does his obsession with beauty, aesthetics, and mastery relate to his underlying emotional needs? How does this obsession affect his sense of worth and interactions with others? Was there a sense of validation with the relationship between Fulgrim and the Emperor? Or did Fulgrim feel overlooked in comparison to some of his brothers? How does this influence his decisions and how he leads his legion? What role did Fulgrim's deep connection to art and beauty play in how he led the Emperor's armies? And how did this change when he fell to chaos? What about the role of pride and vanity in his fall? We've already looked at that some, but more in depth perhaps. How did these traits shape his downfall? How did Fulgrim perceive his own sense of identity as an aspiring, perfect being? And how did that conflict with the reality of his emotional and psychological struggles? What about the relationship with his brothers? His sometime friendly rivalry with Ferris is well documented, but what emotional factors drove this conflict? Did Fulgrim's pride play a larger role than just a sibling rivalry? What about how Fulgrim viewed his fractured legion after the heresy? Did he see himself as a liberator, as a leader to change humanity, or something else? How did he justify the choices he made leading up to the heresy, during the heresy, and after the heresy? Please consider leaving a comment and then making your own darn video about which of these questions you might find interesting.